Tonight we begin with a grim, dangerous, and not so glamorous world of medieval assassins. Those shadowy figures who crept through castle halls and darkened alleys to change history with a blade and a whisper. While Hollywood makes them look cool, the truth is being a medieval assassin seriously sucked. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's be clear, no one in medieval times woke up and said, "You know what? I'd like to stab a nobleman in the throat for 12 silver coins and the honor of hiding in a barrel for 3 days." Becoming an assassin wasn't a career path. It was more like a last stop on the life of a horribly wrong train. Most medieval assassins were mysterious loners trained in mountaintop temples. They were desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, ex-thieves with decent aim, or people so far off society's radar they could kill a man and still not be noticed in the census. If you were well off, you didn't become an assassin. You hired one. If you had a title, land, or even a goat to your name, you were in management. But if you just escaped debtor's prison, had a reputation for solving problems, and could sneak into a tavern without being seen, congratulations. Someone, somewhere was about to slide a coin purse across the table and whisper a name. And that name wasn't a fun one. You weren't asked to take out Bob, the quiet turnip farmer. It was usually a corrupt baron, a bishop with too much gold, or someone with 12 bodyguards and a moat. The pay? Tempting. The job? Horrifying. But by the time someone considered it, they had nothing left to lose. No family, no future, and definitely no dental plan. Plus, let's not forget the absolute lack of job perks. No pension, no glory, no evenings off. You couldn't exactly hang up a shingle that said quiet eliminations by appointment. You just had to stay quiet, move fast, and never ever tell anyone what you did for a living. Especially not loudly over ale at the end. Oh yeah, I'm a traveling carpet seller. The stains die. So yes, nobody dreamed of being a medieval assassin. They landed there because the world chewed them up and spat them out, wearing a hood and holding a rusty dagger. You weren't the hero. You weren't even the villain. You were the footnote that made everyone nervous and probably didn't live to enjoy the coin. Let's burst the first myth wide open. Medieval assassins didn't train under candlelight in some hidden monastery with wise mentors and inspirational flute music in the background. There was no montage, no teacher, no pep talk. If you learned anything, it was by not dying the first few times you tried. Most assassins weren't trained professionals. They were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of direction and the ability to climb quietly without sneezing. If you had military experience, great. That meant you knew how to hold a knife properly. If not, well, stabbing someone is fairly intuitive, but escaping afterward with both kidneys still intact, that takes skill or luck. Usually just luck. There were no manuals, no guild orientation meetings, no safety briefings. You didn't get taught how to spot a body double or where nobles keep their bedroom exits. You figured it out while hanging from a windowsill, wondering if you just crept into the servants' quarters again. Poison. That was trial and error, with heavy emphasis on error. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes your target just got mildly dizzy and more suspicious of his soup. Sometimes you drink the wrong cup. There was no medieval poison control hotline. Just hope, herbal guesswork, and a strong stomach. Sure, if you were lucky, and I mean lottery lucky, you might have picked up some skills from thieves or mercenaries. Maybe an older assassin showed you how to walk without squeaking on cobblestones. But mentoring wasn't standard. It was rare and short-lived because assassins don't retire, they disappear. Weapons training. Forget it. You weren't carrying a broadsword. You had a dagger you stole off a guard, maybe a garrote if you were feeling fancy, and whatever else fit under your cloak without jingling. So no, you weren't some shadowy martial arts master. You were a guy with calloused hands, quiet footsteps, and a deeply unhealthy relationship with alleyways. Success didn't come from training. It came from survival. You learned how to kill by doing it quickly, sloppily, then vanishing before anyone could sketch your face and tack it to a church door. In short, your education was brutal, practical, and offered zero graduation ceremonies. Just bruises, bloodstains, and the creeping realization that you were very much on your own. Let's talk about why you became an assassin in the first place. Coin. Cold, heavy, jangly, deliciously spendable coin. The promise of it is what got you into this. But the reality, you got paid in lies. When someone hires an assassin, they don't want a long-term relationship. They want a one-time service, no paperwork, and ideally no witnesses, including you. They offer you a pouch of silver, half now, half when a job is done. That's if they're feeling generous. But here's the thing, when the job is done, it is code for after we verify you didn't mess it up, or make us look bad, or leave a trail that leads back to us, or survive long enough to tell anyone about it. So you do the job. You sneak through shadows, risk your life, maybe kill a baron in his sleep. Not pretty, not poetic. And when you return, yes, about that payment. The client fled, terribly sorry. Or worse, they try to kill you. A knife to the gut is cheaper than a bonus. And even when you do get paid, it's never quite enough. Not for the risk. Not for the blood. Not for the 3 days you spent hiding in a haystack with fleas and moral regret. You get a handful of coins, curt nod, and a reminder. You were never here. Also, fun fact. Some contracts were fake political traps. You'd be told to assassinate someone dangerous, only to find out it was a decoy with guards waiting. Congratulations, you just walked into a sting operation with your name already carved on the gallows. And even when the deal was real, you couldn't exactly go to court and file a complaint. Your Honor, I'd like to sue Lord Edmund for breach of assassin contract. The only court you'd see was the one where you were the exhibit. So you learned to take what you could, demand payment up front, and trust absolutely no one. Not even the greasy little scribe who swore this job would change your life. It did, mostly by shortening it. Being an assassin meant living on broken promises and vanishing before they broke you. So you've taken the job. You've been lied to about the pay. You're probably going to die. Now let's talk gear. Forget the fantasy novels and sneaky video games. There were no retractable wrist blades, smoke bombs, enchanted daggers, or crossbows that folded neatly into your boot. Your toolkit consisted of whatever you could steal, sharpen, or hide beneath a tattered cloak without clanking. If you were lucky, and I mean found a gold coin in a dead man's shoe, lucky you had a good dagger. Not ornate, not curved like a dragon's tooth. Just sharp, hopefully rust-free, and ideally one that didn't smell like the last guy you stabbed with it. Poison. It existed, sure, but it wasn't as glamorous as a slow drip into a wine goblet. Most medieval poisons were unpredictable, made from plants, minerals, or toad guts. Some worked instantly. Some took hours. Some made your victim vomit for 2 days and then recover, angrier and now very suspicious of stew. Ropes. Occasionally useful. You could strangle, climb, or tie something up with one, but you better know how to use it fast, because nothing kills the mood like trying to wrestle someone while muttering. Wait, which knot goes under again? Well, effective. Yes, if you had one knew how to shoot it, and weren't trying to smuggle it through a palace disguised as a flower arranger. Most assassinations were up close and personal. No time for elegant marksmanship, just quick, quiet, and hopefully not messy enough to slip in. And you didn't get backups if your blade bent, broke, or fell down a well. Time to improvise. Slate roof tile? Maybe. Rusty nails? Worth a shot. Shoe, buckle with intent? Desperate times. You carried your tools hidden in hems, boots, or inside hollowed-out bread if needed, and you kept them close. Not for safety, but because in this line of work, your weapon was your best friend, your boss, and your only retirement plan. There were no upgrades. No tinkering with gear between missions. You didn't polish your kit. You prayed it didn't betray you mid-strike. Because in the end, it wasn't the weapon that did the killing. It was you alone, poorly equipped and expected to perform miracles with a spoon and a prayer. Assassins weren't hired to take out random drunks in back alleys. No one paid you to stab Jeff, the sleepy candle maker. Your targets were important. Nobles, bishops, military officers, sometimes even royalty. And those people, they were very hard to kill. First, there were the guards. Not one or two. Dozens. Armored and well fed. Some guarded the front, some the back. Some just stood there, looking intimidating, daring you to blink wrong. You'd spend days memorizing patrol patterns, door creaks, and exactly how many stairs it took before the night with asthma needed a breather. Second, there were walls. Castles didn't have front porches. They had gatehouses, murder holes, and moats full of things that bite. If you didn't fall into the water, you still had to worry about arrow slits and boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil. Your job description included may get flambéed for peeking. Third, there were the servants and staff, the cooks, scribes, and stable boys. One wrong look from you, and they'd be whispering to the guard captain faster than you could say, "I'm just a herbalist." Assassins weren't just fighting swords, they were fighting gossip. And medieval gossip travels at light speed if it means someone gets to keep their head. And finally, your actual target? Paranoid. Rightfully so. These people were surrounded by backstabbers, relatives with claims to their titles, and 36 people pretending to like them. They didn't eat without a tester. They didn't sleep without 3 locks on the door. Some even slept in decoy beds or rotated rooms like a deadly version of musical chairs. And don't get excited if you hear they're attending a feast. Yes, they'll be drunk, but so will you. And you'll still have to get past the royal guards, 3 dogs, a very alert jester, and 50 witnesses holding tankards. Even getting close to your target could take weeks. Posing as a servant, bribing a chambermaid, hiding in barrels. And when the moment finally came, you had one shot. One precise, perfect, non-squeaky, non-bloody. Ghost vanishes in the night moment. Or you become the next public deterrent, swinging from a castle gate with a sign that read "Nice try." Let's be honest, when you picture a medieval assassin, you probably imagine sleek black robes, leather braces, maybe a mysterious hood billowing in the moonlight. Reality, you look like a sick goat herder with something to hide. Disguises in the Middle Ages weren't exactly high fashion. You didn't have custom-tailored cloaks or retractable armor. You had whatever you could scavenge. Peasant rags, a monk's robe 2 sizes too big, or the remains of a guard uniform that definitely still smelled like its previous owner. The goal was to blend in, but blending in meant looking like everyone else who hadn't bathed in 2 weeks, limped from old injuries, and had a nervous twitch from malnutrition. You didn't look suspicious because of your cloak. You looked suspicious because you kept adjusting your belt to hide a dagger wrapped in cheesecloth. And forget masks. There were no Guy Fawkes options. Most face coverings just made you look like a leper, which was great for avoiding conversation, but terrible for entering parties. If anyone asked who you were, you had to think fast. I'm Brother Tobias. I take care of silent prayer and rooftop maintenance. Even assuming you made it past the guards, noble households weren't full of idiots. Servants noticed unfamiliar faces, especially ones that fumbled chamber pots and couldn't name the cook's cat. You were always one. I've never seen you before away from being clubbed with a candlestick. And if your disguise did work, congratulations. You now had to stay in character for hours while pretending not to notice all the very stab-worthy people wandering by. Also wigs. They didn't exist. If you needed to look older or younger, you were stuck smearing dirt on your face, squinting, and hoping no one got close enough to notice that your beard was glued on with honey. The truth was, your disguise didn't protect you. It gave you maybe 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you had to be gone, invisible, or very, very convincing. And if anyone saw through it, well, let's just say no one wants to be the assassin caught in the bishop's laundry room, wearing a nun's habit and holding a sword. Especially not on a feast day. In medieval times, if you were an assassin, you didn't have a team. You didn't have a sidekick with a crossbow, a clever alchemist in a secret lair, or a handler who gave you coded scrolls and warm encouragement. You had a rusty dagger and crippling trust issues. There were no guilds, at least not ones you could actually count on. And if there were whispers of a brotherhood of assassins, it was mostly tavern talk fueled by mead and boredom. You were more likely to meet a ghost than another professional killer who wanted to network. Why the isolation? Because in your business, the fewer people who knew you existed, the longer you lived. Every contact was a risk. Every loose tongue, a potential noose. Even your client might not know your real name. And if they did, you were already planning your exit. Companionship. Laughable. Friends asked questions. Lovers noticed bruises, bloodstains, and why you always slept with a blade under the pillow. You couldn't settle down. You couldn't afford to. One mistake, one person recognizing you in a market, and your whole life turned into a sprint for the nearest sewer grate. Even fellow criminals kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers were sociable. You were that guy who makes people disappear. They feared you, or worse, saw you as a walking liability. No one wanted to share stew with someone whose occupation could attract a mob with torches. And don't expect sympathy. You couldn't tell anyone how hard it was to sleep after silently strangling a corrupt bishop. If you talked about your job, people assumed you were either lying or dangerous, and they weren't wrong. So you kept your secrets, your scars, and your weapons to yourself. At inns, you sat in the darkest corner, back to the wall, as always scanning the door. You never drank too much. You never stayed more than a night. You didn't say your name unless someone paid you first. And even then, it probably wasn't your real one. Being a medieval assassin meant perfecting the art of vanishing, not just in a crowd, but from every life you never got to have. Let's say you took the job. You planned your route. You bribed the right doorman. You disguised yourself as a very convincing chimney sweep. And then you froze. Maybe the target turned around unexpectedly. Maybe they were with their child. Maybe you got the shakes at the worst possible moment, and your knife hand trembled like a terrified squirrel. Guess what? You're now dead. Because failure for a medieval assassin wasn't a slap on the wrist or a bad performance review. It was a public, painful, and wildly theatrical death, often involving ropes, fire wheels, or sharp iron devices with names like the Bonecracker's Delight. Missing the kill meant blowing the whole operation. Your target lived and immediately told everyone that someone tried to murder them. Suddenly, you weren't a shadow. You were a wanted man with a detailed description and probably a crude sketch tacked to every tavern wall within 30 miles. And those guards you once snuck past, now they're motivated. Sometimes it wasn't even your target you had to worry about. It was your client. If you failed, you were no longer an asset. You were a liability. Someone who could be tortured, interrogated, or worse, talk. The very people who paid you would be the first to put out a second contract on you. And there were no second chances. No. Sorry, the blade slipped. I'll try again tomorrow. You had one shot, one moment in time, and if you blew it, the best you could hope for was to die quickly before anyone found out who hired you. Failure also meant shame, the silent, humiliating kind. You didn't just fail to kill, you failed to be invisible, to be perfect. And for assassins, perfection was survival. Anything less? Might as well paint a target on your back and start practicing your final word speech. It didn't matter how many jobs you'd done before. No one cared that you succeeded 12 times because in this profession you're only as good as your last kill. And if your last kill didn't happen, you'd better start running. So you did it. The plan worked. The dagger struck true. No screams, no guards, just a clean drop to the floor and a very important person who now wasn't. Congratulations. Now run for your life because you were a successful assassin in medieval times. Didn't mean sipping wine on a rooftop while the city burns behind you. It meant fleeing through back alleys with someone's blood on your boots and a dog already sniffing your trail. There was no victory lap, no post-job drink with colleagues, no casual debrief with your client. You didn't even get a moment to admire your work. The moment your blade struck, your new job became escaping everyone who now wants to murder you in increasingly creative ways. Guards coming. Doors locked. Horses tied up on the other side of town. You are probably bleeding. You had to plan your exit before the kill. Routes, disguises, fallback, safe houses. Maybe a boatman who owed you a favor, or at least didn't ask questions because the city would go on lockdown within minutes. No one wanted a scandal, and lockdown meant closed gates, armed checkpoints, and a dozen angry men with swords who all just received your rough sketch, and the phrase may be armed and extremely stabby. And let's talk about the client. Assuming they actually planned to pay you, they weren't going to meet you at a cozy tavern with a smile and a thank you card. They'd probably vanish too, because an assassin who just completed a job is the most dangerous person alive. You knew too much. You'd proven you could get into places others couldn't. So even when you succeeded, you walked away with a coin in one hand and a giant target on your back. And what did you win? A week of sleeping in haylofts, bribing ferry captains, shaving your beard in the dark, and pretending your name was Brother Lucian as you tried to blend in with monks heading east. Because success didn't mean survival. It meant starting the whole game over in a new city, under a new name, with even more people looking for you this time. So yes, you made the kill. Now run like hell. If being a medieval assassin wasn't already miserable enough, poor, hunted, and sleeping in places that smelled like goats, you also had to deal with the wonderfully creative paranoia of the people around you. Because in the Middle Ages, assassins weren't just feared, they were considered cursed to the average peasant. You weren't just a killer in a hood, you were some unholy creature who whispered to demons and smeared frog guts on your blade under a full moon. Why else would you be able to sneak past guards and vanish in the dark? Logic wasn't exactly popular back then, but superstition? Oh, that was everywhere. Some believed assassins could shapeshift. Others claimed you were invisible unless bathed in holy water. One popular tale suggested assassins made pacts with forest spirits and could breathe death through walls. Imagine walking through a village and hearing a woman mutter, "Don't make eye contact. He might hex the baby." Even your tools were suspected of carrying a dagger. Clearly it was forged in a cursed forge using poison. That wasn't chemistry. That was witchcraft. And you probably stirred it with a severed toe under a blood moon. You think this fear might help you. After all, people avoided you, right? But the reality was worse. Superstitious mobs don't hesitate. They don't ask questions. They throw stones, set fires, and shout things like "burn him" before he calls lightning. Your reputation made people overreact. The second someone died unexpectedly, illness, accident, choking on a chicken bone, someone would whisper, maybe it was a shadow man. Maybe it was him. You could be hunted just for existing in the same village as a suspicious death. That meant you had to keep moving. Always stay too long. And suddenly a priest is ringing a bell while 5 angry farmers hold pitchforks like they've been waiting for this moment their entire lives. Heaven help you if you were caught with anything remotely weird. Dried herbs, strange coins, or even a foreign accent. That's all it took for someone to shout sorcerer and light a torch. In a world that believed monsters wore human faces, being too quiet, too clever, or too fast made you a threat. And in medieval logic, threats had to die. Quickly, and preferably on fire. Poison. The assassin's weapon of elegance. Quiet kill. No mess. No screaming. No steel on bone. Just a sip. A stagger. A sigh. And done. That's the theory in practice. Poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was like trying to win a bar fight with herbal tea and a bad attitude. First off, poisons weren't reliable. You didn't have access to purified cyanide or a neat little pill labeled fast-acting doom. You had plants, mushrooms, minerals, maybe the occasional toad. You had to gather, grind, and pray. And even then, it might just give the target a stomach ache and a renewed commitment to his anti-assassin guard team. There was no scientific measurement. You didn't dose precisely. You eyeballed it. A pinch too little, and the noble just vomits and cancels dinner. A pinch too much, and you die from exposure before the first course is served. Also, medieval kitchens were chaotic. You couldn't just waltz in and season the soup with nightshade. You had to bribe or impersonate a cook, sneak in while no one was watching, or worst of all, try to poison a meal that would go through 3 tasters and a dog. Yes, a dog. And if your victim was a noble, they didn't just eat food. They treated it like a military operation. Meals were tasted, blessed, and sniffed by everyone, from the steward to the jester. By the time the food hit their plate, it had passed through more security than a royal wedding. Even assuming you did it, you slipped in the poison. It wasn't detected, and the target actually ate it. The next part was wildly unpredictable. Some poisons took hours, some took days. One minute your mark is laughing at a joke. Next, he's clutching his stomach and demanding to see his astrologer. And if they survived, guess who they blame? Not the cook, not the taster. You, the quiet man with herbal knowledge and twitchy eyes. So poisoning wasn't efficient. It was risky, slow, and full of variables, none of them in your favor. And if you were caught, you didn't get a quick death. You got interrogated with tools. Until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the duke to the dog, you think that if you successfully changed the course of history by removing a tyrant, sabotaging a royal bloodline, or silencing a political threat, someone would remember your name. No, you were an assassin. That meant your name was never meant to be remembered. At best, you were a rumor, some hooded figure, a foreigner with cold eyes, or the quiet man who never finished his ale. You might have pulled off the most legendary hit of the century and still ended up as a mysterious death in the official record. In fact, that was the point. Your client didn't want a story. They wanted plausible deniability. The fewer people who knew who did it, the safer they were, and the less likely they were to end up poisoned by their own assassin. So your name was buried the moment the job was done. If you even used a real one, you didn't sign your work. You didn't brag. You didn't keep trophies. You didn't exist outside the moment of the kill. And if someone did know your name, that was a loose end. And in your profession, loose ends had a very short shelf life. And forget about honor. There were no medals for silence, no stone monuments for the man who stopped a war with one dagger in the night. If a noble wanted a statue, they commissioned one for themselves. You got a wooden box, unmarked grave. Or if things went really badly, a head on a spike labeled traitor. Sometimes your name was known only so it could be cursed. You become a whispered warning. Don't cross the king. Remember what happened to Lord Ulrich. Yes, and the man who did it. Gone. Like a ghost. That was your legacy. Not fame. Not fear. Just absence. You weren't supposed to leave a mark. You were supposed to vanish. And if you stuck around long enough to be known, that was a fatal mistake. Because in a medieval world, heroes are remembered. Assassins got erased. So you survived. You got the job done. You even managed to get paid. A miracle in itself. Now all you have to do is lay low. Keep your head down and trust that your client will honor the deal and protect your identity. Right? Wrong. Because in the world of medieval assassination, there was one rule even more sacred than don't get caught. Never trust anyone, especially the person paying you. Your client, be they a noble, a merchant, or a bishop with ambition and very loose morals, didn't hire you out of respect. They hired you because they needed something awful done, and you were the sharpest tool in the shadows. Once the job was complete, you became a liability. You knew too much. You knew who wanted who died, when, why, and possibly how much they were willing to pay for it. That made you dangerous, not just to their enemies, but to them. So what did they do? They ghosted you. They denied they ever met you, or worse. They sent someone else after you to clean up, to tie off the contract with something sharper than ink. There were even cases where clients double-booked, hiring one assassin to do the job and another to kill the first one immediately after. No refunds, just reduced risk. And if you dared try to blackmail a client, threaten to expose them, that was bold. And also your final mistake because powerful people in the Middle Ages didn't negotiate with assassins. They crushed them. If your client had a shred of honor, a rare species indeed, you might get paid and left alone. But even then, you'd still have to assume they were watching you from a distance, with someone already sharpening steel and memorizing your walk. You were the secret that couldn't talk, the shadow that couldn't stay. Even success wasn't enough to earn trust, because in their eyes, if you killed once, you could kill again. And no one, not even the person who hired you, wanted to be next. Let's say somehow you beat the odds. You survived the kills, the lies, the poisonings, betrayals. You outlived your enemies, your employers, and probably your own sense of morality. Now what? You retire? Absolutely not. Because in medieval times, assassins didn't get retirement plans. There were no farewell banquets, no quiet cottages by the sea, no pensions paid in gold coins and grateful whispers. You didn't fade into a peaceful life. You vanished or you died, often both. The problem was simple. You were never safe. Even if you walked away from the job, your past didn't. You had too many secrets in your head, too many names in your memory, and too much blood on your hands. People didn't want you to retire. They wanted you forgotten, which usually meant buried. And even if no one came after you, and that's a big if, you had to live with a constant fear that someone might. That a new assassin, young and eager to prove himself, had just received a contract for a shadowy figure who used to be someone dangerous. So you changed your name again. You moved to a village where no one asked questions. You faked a limp, sold herbs, pretended you once worked as a guard. But even then, you didn't sleep well. You avoided crowds. You always sat facing the door. You kept your dagger under the floorboard, next to the pouch of coins you never touched, because it still smelled like the man you earned it from. And you couldn't trust yourself either. Years of silent killings and quick escapes did something to your brain. Every knock on the door made you flinch. Every stranger on the road might recognize you. You stopped dreaming because dreaming was dangerous. You couldn't love. You couldn't relax. You couldn't laugh too loud. You lived like a ghost, pretending to be a man. The truth was, there was no end game for a medieval assassin. Just a slow, cold fade into obscurity. Always moving, always watching. Until one day, you slipped into the dark. And no one noticed. And maybe that was the best you could hope for. By now, you probably figured it out. Being a medieval assassin wasn't darkly romantic. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even all that profitable. It was a grim, thankless, short-lived career, wrapped in blood-stained linen and followed by a crowd of people who wanted you dead. You wouldn't last. Not a week. Maybe not even a day. Because you'd start with the wrong assumptions that you'd be sleek, in control, a whisper in the dark. But what you'd really be is cold, hungry, and one bad guess away from a noose. You'd slip into town, cloak pulled tight, ready for action, only to discover that your target moved locations. The guards are drunk but trigger happy, and the stable boy you pay for information just sold you out for a mug of ale and a piece of bread. You'd freeze at the wrong time, stab the wrong guy, get spotted by someone's maid who once saw your face near the chapel, and suddenly you're not a shadow. You're the problem. Then what? You run. But you're not used to medieval terrain. The mud, the uneven cobblestones, the absolutely insane number of loose chickens in the street. You slip, fall, get tackled by a guard named Thomas who just got dumped and is looking for an outlet. And let's say you survive that. Then you deal with the aftermath. No allies, no honor, and no future. Just whispers, suspicion, and the growing realization that even if you succeed, the best you can hope for is to die old and alone, hiding behind a false name in a village that still believes in fairies. So no, you wouldn't last. And frankly, you shouldn't try, because the assassin's life wasn't cool. It was a cruel machine that chewed people up and spat out nothing but shadows. It offered power without peace and purpose without a place in the world. You didn't make history. You erased yourself from it. And the only thing waiting for you at the end was silence. A silence no one would question, because no one even remembered you were there in the first place. Before she was the feared queen of Macedonia, Olympias was known as Myrtille, a Meletian princess from the rugged tribal lands of Epirus. Her people claimed descent from Achilles himself, and whether or not the blood of heroes truly ran in her veins, one thing was certain. This was not a woman born for the sidelines of history. From a young age, Myrtle was steeped in mystery and ritual. Her upbringing was shaped not just by politics, but by prophecy, ecstatic rites, and a reverence for the ancient gods. She wasn't the type of princess who smiled and embroidered tapestries. No, she was drawn to serpents, omens, and the frenzied ceremonies of the cult of Dionysus, where women danced barefoot in the moonlight and called upon the divine in states of trance. Her connection to the gods wasn't performative, it was personal. She didn't merely worship, she embodied, according to ancient sources, likely written by men both terrified and enthralled. She kept sacred snakes in her chambers and even allowed them to coil beside her in bed. Whether this was a literal fact or the kind of slander that powerful women attract like flies, we'll never know. But it stuck. To her allies, it made her divine. To her enemies, it made her dangerous. Her real power began not in a battlefield or throne room, but in the uneasy flicker of torchlight. Among the whispers of priestesses and the curling bodies of serpents, she wasn't just a princess, she was a living oracle, a woman touched by something older than politics and colder than steel. So when Philip II of Macedon, brutal, brilliant, and famously horny, arrived at the island of Samothrace for a religious initiation, he didn't just meet a beautiful princess, he met a mystery he couldn't resist. Their marriage wasn't just a political alliance. It was a collision of prophecy and power. And from the very beginning, it was full of omens. Some said lightning struck the sky on their wedding night. Others claimed Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb. All of it would become legend. But one thing is certain. The union of Olympias and Philip didn't just create a child. It created Alexander the Great. And she intended to shape his destiny from the very first breath. Olympia's marriage to Philip II was not the fairy tale one might expect for a queen who would one day birth an empire. From the beginning, it was a combustible mix of prophecy, pride, and paranoia. Philip, ruthless, charismatic, and already collecting wives like trophies, married Olympias around 357 BCE. She was likely just a teenager, but she wasn't naive. She saw in Philip a man whose ambition matched her own, and perhaps even a divine match for her spiritual destiny. Macedon wasn't exactly an easy kingdom to walk into. It was a land of iron and ambition, where kings were killed by cousins and brothers, turned into rivals overnight. But Olympias, the priestess of Epirus, walked in with her head held high and eyes already on the crown. Their marriage was rocky from the start. Philip, for all his political genius, was not built for monogamy. He would go on to marry multiple women, often for alliances, always for power. But Olympias wasn't one to sit quietly in the shadows. She held her own court, maintained her own alliances, and was known to turn to oracles and rites to divine her future, and perhaps Philip's fate. Then came the birth of Alexander. Even that was wrapped in celestial drama. Legends say Olympias dreamed that a thunderbolt struck her womb and that flames danced around her child without burning him. Philip reportedly had a vision of sealing his wife's womb with a lion. Yes, a literal lion. Whether they believed these visions or invented them, they certainly acted as if Alexander was destined to rule not just a kingdom, but the world. But even as the child was celebrated, cracks in the royal marriage deepened. Olympias resented Philip's other wives, especially his Macedonian bride, Cleopatra Eurydice, whom he married later in life. This was more than a domestic issue. It was a threat. Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and any son she bore would be purer in the eyes of the local nobility, a direct threat to Alexander's future. Olympias saw it clearly. The palace wasn't just a home. It was a battlefield, and she would use every snake, dream, ritual, and whisper she had to make sure her son wasn't just remembered, but crowned. She was no longer Myrtle. She was Olympias now, and no one would take her son's throne without facing her wrath. By the time Alexander was a teenager, the Macedonian palace in Pella had become a war zone of veiled insults, political maneuvering, and bitter rivalries. Olympias wasn't just fighting for influence, she was fighting for survival. She knew that the court was filled with snakes, but she was the one who taught them how to bite. Philip, too, had begun to distance himself from her. He was campaigning more, drinking more, and perhaps worst of all, listening more to his Macedonian advisors. The final blow came when he married a young noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice. Not to be confused with the Cleopatra of Egypt, this Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and her uncle Attalus was one of Philip's top generals. To Olympias, it wasn't just betrayal, it was a declaration of war. The marriage ceremony was a disaster. At the feast, Attalus drunkenly mocked Olympias and Alexander, calling into question the legitimacy of Alexander's birth. Was he really Philip's son, or was he the child of a god? As Olympias liked to claim, it was meant as an insult. But Olympias seized the myth. Let them whisper. Let them believe her son was touched by Zeus. It made him untouchable. Alexander stormed out of the feast. Olympias left Macedon entirely, retreating to Epirus. But her exile was not defeated. It was a strategy in her homeland. She was still royalty. She could gather support, whisper in ears, and watch as Philip's palace began to rot from within. She didn't need to be physically present to be dangerous. Then came the shockwave. Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, just as he was about to invade Persia, just as he was on the verge of crowning himself not just king of Macedon, but potential emperor of the known world. The question that echoed through every marble corridor and torchlit hall was the same. Who did it? Was it Pausanias, the jilted bodyguard who carried out the act? Was it the result of court intrigue? Was it Alexander himself? Or whisper it softly, was it Olympias? No one could prove it. No one dared. But many believed it. After all, within days, Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn child were dead. Murdered, some say, by Olympias herself. The serpent had returned to the palace, and now nothing stood between her son and the throne. With Philip dead and Macedon in mourning or confusion, Olympias made her move. While others scrambled to understand the chaos, she acted swiftly, brutally, decisively. First, Cleopatra Eurydice, the young Macedonian queen and rival wife, was eliminated. According to chilling accounts, Olympias didn't just have her killed. She made her death symbolic, public, humiliating. Some say Cleopatra was forced to hang herself after watching her infant daughter be murdered. Others claim Olympias had the child thrown onto a funeral pyre. What's agreed upon is this: no mercy was shown. Olympias understood what many mothers in ancient courts refused to accept. In a royal palace, mercy is a liability. A rival child, no matter how small, is a future war, and Olympias was done playing defense. With Cleopatra and her bloodline erased, she could turn her attention to securing Alexander's throne. Her teenage son, bold, brilliant, already trained by Aristotle, was declared king without serious opposition. But don't be fooled. It wasn't just his charisma or his father's legacy that made it possible. It was Olympias. She knew which generals to threaten, which nobles to flatter, and which enemies to quietly remove. She wasn't just protecting her son's rise, she was engineering it. Alexander himself didn't always approve. He reportedly disapproved of the violence against Cleopatra's family, but he also didn't stop it, because deep down he knew what Olympias had always known. Power demands blood, and in Macedon, bloodlines were both a blessing and a curse. With her son now king, Olympias began to recede slightly from public life. But this was no retirement. She simply shifted from open strikes to whispered influence. As Alexander prepared to launch his conquest of Persia, she remained behind, not as a passive queen mother, but as the spiritual guardian of his destiny. She sent him sacred relics, consulted oracles, and performed rituals on his behalf. To Olympias, her son's mission wasn't just military, it was divine. Alexander wasn't going to war. He was fulfilling prophecy, and as long as she drew breath, no rival, Macedonian, Persian, or otherwise, would derail that divine plan. She had crowned her son. She had cleansed the palace. Now she would guard his empire from behind the curtain with teeth bared. As Alexander marched east to conquer the known world, Olympias remained behind in Macedon, a queen without a throne, but not without power. Her official title was Queen Mother, but make no mistake, she ruled in all but name. Though regency was technically handed to Antipater, one of Alexander's trusted generals, Olympias refused to be sidelined. She wrote letters to her son constantly, advising, warning, sometimes chastising him. These weren't the sweet letters of a doting mother. They were political briefings laced with oracles and venom. And Alexander, thousands of miles away, read every word. She reminded him who his true enemies were. She questioned the loyalty of his companions. She criticized his fascination with Persian customs, his choice of wives, and his flirtation with calling himself a god. No one else dared say these things to him. But Olympias was never afraid to speak as a mother or a priestess of divine will. Back in Macedon, Antipater grew increasingly resentful. Olympias undermined him at every turn. She used her status, her religious authority, and her family ties to stir opposition against him. She had influence in Epirus, in Thessaly, and among the aristocracy. She could spread rumors like wildfire, and with Olympias, a whisper could be deadlier than a sword. Meanwhile, her letters to Alexander became more urgent. She warned him of Antipater's ambition, painting him as a second Philip, ready to betray and usurp. Whether she truly believed it or simply feared losing her grip, she kept pressing her son to act. Alexander, however, hesitated. He needed Antipater to keep order in Greece while he fought in Asia, and so the rift between mother and general widened. Olympias watched. She waited, but beneath her religious robes and maternal concern, she was growing impatient. She hadn't endured years of palace warfare to be ruled over by an old soldier. As Alexander's empire stretched from the Aegean to India, Olympias saw cracks forming. He was taking on too much, trusting too many foreign advisors, and drifting away from the mother and the gods that made him. She believed his victories came from divine favor and from her, and if he forgot that, well, Olympias knew how to remind kings who they really were, even if that king was her own son. When news of Alexander's death in Babylon reached Macedon in 323 BCE, it didn't arrive like a trumpet. It arrived like a dagger. For Olympias, it wasn't just the loss of a son. It was the collapse of a world she had spent decades building. Her boy, the divine storm she had prophesied, raised, unleashed, was gone. And he'd left behind no clear heir, no single successor, only chaos. The mighty empire he carved out was already fracturing. Generals, his so-called successors, were already dividing it up like jackals around a corpse. Antipater still held power in Macedon and Greece, and he had no love for Olympias. Worse, her daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was being courted by rival generals for marriage, each one hoping to use her bloodline as a claim to the throne. Olympias saw what was coming. Civil war wasn't a possibility. It was inevitable, and once again she would have to act. But she no longer had Alexander. What she had instead was his bloodline. His young son, Alexander IV, born to Roxana. The Bactrian princess Alexander had married. Roxana, still in Macedon, was vulnerable. The boy was even more so. Olympias recognized that the infant was now the last true piece of her son's legacy, and that made him a target, but it also made him a weapon. She allied herself with Roxana and the boy, determined to protect them and use the child's birthright to stake her own claim in the political battlefield. But the tide was turning. The generals who once bowed to Alexander had no interest in kneeling to his widow or his mother. They had armies now, ambitions and grudges. Olympias didn't flinch. She'd faced snakes, traitors, and kings. A few warlords with crowns and stolen spears wouldn't scare her. So she plotted. She waited. She watched as Antipater died and was replaced by his son Cassander, a man with ice in his veins and no tolerance for the old queen's games. It was only a matter of time before these two forces collided. The serpent mother of Alexander and the cold-eyed usurper who wanted her buried. Alexander was gone, but his shadow was still moving, and Olympias was still coiled within it, ready to strike. Years after Alexander's death, while his empire crumbled into civil war, Olympias made her most audacious move yet. She returned to Macedon, not as a grieving mother, but as a political force of divine fury. The regency had been splintered. Cassander, the son of her old enemy Antipater, was seizing power, and Roxana, along with young Alexander IV, was effectively imprisoned. Olympias saw the writing on the wall. If she did not act now, Her grandson would vanish like a shadow at dusk. So she made a deal with Polypertron, an aging general who still held a flicker of legitimate authority. Olympias would return not to plead, but to rule. With Polypercon's backing, she entered Macedon at the head of an army, and the moment her feet touched home soil, everything changed. Towns opened their gates. Soldiers defected to her side. Even some of her old enemies hesitated. Olympias, despite her age, was still a name that shook the ground. Then came her vengeance. One by one, she hunted down the loyalists of Cassander, and when she finally caught Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's mentally impaired half-brother and puppet king, she ordered his execution. According to some sources, his wife Eurydice was captured and given the opportunity to kill herself. When she refused, Olympias had her strangled. It was brutality veiled in royal protocol, and Olympias, ever theatrical, staged the scene like a goddess delivering justice. Her message was clear. Only the bloodline of Alexander had the right to rule. Everyone else was a pretender. For a brief burning moment, Olympias held the kingdom in her grip. She had restored the dynasty. She had avenged betrayals. She had reminded Macedon what royal power looked like when wielded by a woman with nothing left to lose. But power in Macedon, it was like fire in dry grass, and Cassander was still out there, calculating, biding his time. He returned with a vengeance. His army outnumbered hers, his resources deeper, his cruelty colder. Her allies began to abandon her. Polyperchon lost influence. The tide turned. Olympias, now isolated in the fortress of Pydna, watched as her enemies closed in. She had lit the match. Macedon had burned. And now the smoke was thick, and her enemies were at the gates. Olympias, once the most feared woman in the ancient world, now found herself besieged in the coastal fortress of Pydna, alone, cut off, surrounded by the army of Cassander, who had come to finish what his father had started. But Olympias didn't beg. She didn't plead. For nearly a year, she endured the siege like a statue carved from divine wrath. Food ran short. Disease crept in. Allies vanished. Yet within the fortress walls, she maintained the same unshakable presence that had once shaken kings. To the very end, she carried herself not as a prisoner, but as the mother of a god. Cassander, ever cautious, hesitated. He knew killing Olympias was dangerous. Even now, she carries a myth around her like armor. She was still the mother of Alexander the Great. To strike her down might seem like blasphemy, so he offered her safety. Surrender, he said, and her life would be spared. Olympias knew better. She had seen too many royal promises turn to ash. Still, hunger was no longer just a discomfort. It was death. Her garrison broke, her followers surrendered, and Olympias, unbending until the very end, was finally handed over to her enemies. Cassander didn't kill her himself. That would have been too simple and too merciful. Instead, he turned her over to the families of those she had executed during her brief return to power. Let them decide her fate. They condemned her to death. But here's the catch. When the executioners came, no one dared strike the first blow. Olympia stood tall, regal, silent, eyes fixed on them like an oracle staring through smoke. These were Macedonians. They had grown up hearing of her rituals, her visions, her snakes. They had once cheered her son, the living god, and now here she stood, a frail old woman cloaked in myth, and not a single man had the courage to swing the sword. So Cassander sent others, foreigners, outsiders, people who had no memory of her power, only orders to follow. And thus Olympias was finally struck down, not with ceremony, not with dignity, but with silence. Her death marked the end of Alexander's bloodline and any meaningful power, and with it the final member of an empire founded on divine ambition was snuffed out. But even in death, Olympias left behind a shadow, and history would never forget the Serpent Queen. Olympias died not on a throne, but in the dust, unarmed, abandoned and executed by the very people she once ruled. But history is strange. It does not always favor the ones who die in silk sheets. Sometimes it remembers those who went down hissing. And Olympias was never meant for quiet history. In life, she had wielded motherhood like a sword and prophecy like a shield. She wasn't just the mother of Alexander the Great. She was one of the architects of his rise. Without her, there is no myth of the divine child, no rituals whispering of thunderbolts and lions, no ruthless purging of rivals that cleared the path for a teenage king to rule the known world. Olympias didn't just give birth to an empire, she defended it with claws. Yet even among the ancient world's most ruthless dynasts, Olympias stands apart. She didn't command armies in the field like Cleopatra or ride into battle like Boudica. Her battlefield was subtler and colder. It was a world of poison goblets, political marriages, priestesses, and oracles. She understood the power of fear, and even more importantly, she understood the power of belief. She made people believe her son was divine, and she may have believed it herself. Her enemies branded her a murderer, a witch, a manipulator, and they weren't wrong. Olympias was all those things, and more. She was the product of a brutal world that respected cunning far more than kindness, and she learned early that mercy was a luxury queens couldn't afford. In the centuries that followed, she was both vilified and mythologized. Some called her a villain, others a visionary, but no historian, ancient or modern, could call her irrelevant. She haunted the legacy of Alexander like a phantom, always in the background, always just behind the curtain. And maybe that's exactly where she belonged. Not as a tragic mother or a footnote in a king's story, but as a story unto herself. The woman who wrapped herself in prophecy, slept beside snakes, and outlived gods. Olympia's bones turned to dust long ago, but her legend endures in every tale of ruthless queens, in every whisper of blood-born destiny. In every empire built on myth, she is still there, coiled in the dark, waiting on the sun-bleached island of Crete. Just a few miles south of the modern city of Heraklion lies a ruin that feels more like a dream than a real place. Stone corridors snake in all directions, rooms twist and double back. Staircases lead nowhere. It's easy to lose your sense of direction even today. This place is Knossos, the heart of Minoan civilization, and the supposed inspiration for one of the most enduring myths in human history, the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. But before there was a legend, there was a palace unlike any other. Built around 1900 BCE and expanded over centuries, Knossos wasn't just a royal residence, it was an entire city under one roof. Covering nearly 150,000 square feet, it featured over 1,000 rooms. Light wells, storage magazines, shrines, workshops, and what may have been the first flushing toilets in history. It had running water, multi-story apartments, and an intricate system of air circulation. This wasn't a primitive fortress. It was an architectural masterpiece. To modern archaeologists, Knossos looks like organized chaos. To ancient visitors, it probably felt like magic. The man who brought Knossos into modern awareness was British archaeologist Arthur Evans. In the early 1900s, Evans excavated the site and quickly became convinced that this was the origin of the Greek labyrinth myth. The layout was disorienting, the architecture deeply symbolic, and everywhere he turned he found motifs of bulls painted on walls, carved into stone, or sculpted into tiny golden charms. The bull, after all, was sacred to the Minoans. Evans even went so far as to name the civilization after the mythic king Minos. Whether Minos was real or not, his legend became inseparable from the ruins. But here's the twist. No one's found a literal labyrinth. No underground maze, no prison chambers, no half-man monster. What we have instead is something far more mysterious. A city designed in loops, wings, and layers deliberately difficult to navigate. And the deeper you go, the more the lines between history and mythology blur. So the question remains, was the Minotaur born from these walls, or was the palace itself the monster? Knossos may not give up its answers easily, but it's very good at making us ask the right questions. The myth is as famous as the ruin, a monstrous half-man, half-bull, trapped in a labyrinth so complex that no one who entered ever found their way out. Only Theseus, the Athenian hero, managed to kill the beast and escape thanks to a ball of thread and the cunning of Princess Ariadne. But where did this story come from, and why a labyrinth? The earliest versions of the myth speak of King Minos, the powerful ruler of Crete, who demanded tribute from Athens in the form of 7 boys and 7 girls each year. These unfortunate souls were fed to the Minotaur, a creature born from divine punishment and shame. The Minotaur, locked in an underground maze, symbolized the dark underbelly of power, something savage hidden behind grandeur. To ancient Greeks, Crete had long been a land of wealth, mystery, and fear. Its seafaring people, the Minoans, were seen as both elegant and alien. Their rituals involved bull leaping. Their artwork depicted strange gods, and their palaces were unlike anything on the mainland. To a visiting Greek from 1000 BCE, Knossos might have felt like another world. The bull itself was sacred in Minoan culture. Frescoes show young men and women vaulting over charging bulls in ritual displays. Horns of consecration, stylized bull horns, appear on rooftops and altars. Combine this with a palace that feels like a maze, and the ingredients for a legend begin to stir. But what if the Minotaur wasn't just a monster? What if it was a metaphor? Some scholars believe the tale reflects a memory of Cretan dominance over the Aegean, a time when Athens truly did pay tribute to a stronger, stranger power. The labyrinth could symbolize the political entrapment of weaker states, and the Minotaur, the raw, terrifying force behind Minoan rule. Others argue it's more psychological. The labyrinth as the unconscious mind, the Minotaur as our hidden urges, and Theseus the hero walking bravely into the darkness, guided only by the thread of memory. Still, the myth remains tangled with Knossos. The palace is the closest thing we've ever found to a real labyrinth. No monster, no Ariadne, but perhaps something deeper, not just a myth echoing through history, but a history that was asking to become myth. Long before Athens raised its marble temples or Sparta sharpened its spears, there was the Minoan civilization, one of the earliest advanced societies in Europe. They ruled not through conquest, but through trade, art, and what seems like an almost supernatural command of architecture. At the heart of their power stood Knossos, a palace that wasn't just a seat of royalty, it was a hub of culture, ritual, and economy. The Minoans flourished from around 2600 to 1400 BCE. Based on Crete, they developed a sprawling trade network that reached Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the distant shores of Spain. Their ships cut through the Mediterranean like silent arrows, ferrying pottery, saffron, bronze, and luxury goods. They didn't build vast armies. They built relationships, and that more than weapons made them rich. What's most striking about Minoan culture is how different it was from their later Greek successors. Their artwork celebrated nature, animals, and flowing human movement, not war or divine punishment. Frescoes show dancers, dolphins, and athletes vaulting over bulls. Even their goddesses are different, powerful, bare-breasted figures often holding snakes, symbols of fertility, transformation, or protection. At the center of it all was Knossos, not a fortress on a hill, but a complex in a fertile valley. It had no massive defensive walls, suggesting the Minoans either felt secure on their island or projected enough power to make defense unnecessary. Their confidence was architectural. Multi-story buildings, colonnaded courtyards, and advanced plumbing systems hinted at a society far ahead of its time, and yet, for all their sophistication, the Minoans left behind no deciphered written records. Their primary script, Linear A, remains unreadable to this day. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what their kings believed, what prayers they spoke, or what truly happened behind the walls of Knossos. All we have are their ruins, their art, and their influence, absorbed later by the Mycenaeans and echoed in Greek myths. The Minoans were not just builders of palaces. They were architects of mystery. And Knossos wasn't merely a building. It was the beating heart of a civilization that shimmered for a moment like sunlight on the Aegean and then vanished. But some say their echo still wanders the maze. To walk through Knossos is to walk through time. Layered, confusing, beautiful time. It's not just the scale that overwhelms you. It's the design. Rooms lead to rooms. Corridors split and vanish. Light wells cut through the heart of the building. Stairs spiral into shadows or emerge suddenly into sunlit courtyards. Nothing moves in a straight line. It's not hard to see why ancient visitors might have whispered labyrinth. Knossos wasn't just a palace, it was a living organism. Spanning an estimated 150,000 square feet, the complex contained over 1,000 chambers, some tiny, some grand. These weren't randomly placed rooms. They were purpose-built workshops, storage spaces, and shrines. Apartments and throne rooms all arranged around a large central courtyard that may have hosted public ceremonies or bull leaping rituals. The palace was built on multiple levels, up to 4 or 5 stories tall in places, using natural slopes and artificial terraces. To navigate it without getting lost, you'd need memory, instinct, or a thread like Theseus. And yet this apparent chaos hides a remarkable intelligence. The Minoans mastered passive ventilation, cooling rooms through air shafts and open stairwells. They funneled rainwater through clay pipes and had toilets that flushed long before Rome made it fashionable. One of the most iconic areas is the so-called throne room, named for the alabaster chair built into the wall, flanked by benches. Around it are frescoes of griffins, mythical guardians. Was this the seat of a priest-king? A goddess's chamber? A sacred court? No one knows for certain. And the walls? They speak in color. Vibrant frescoes show dolphins swimming above bathtubs. Women in elegant flounced skirts with bare chests use leaping bulls midair. The art wasn't just decoration, it was identity. Fluid, natural, deeply connected to earth and sea. Still, the deeper you go, the more Knossos begins to disorient. Some parts seem intentionally complex, like they were designed to confuse. Maybe that's the root of the labyrinth legend. Not a prison for monsters, but a palace that felt alive. A building that invited awe, ritual, and just a touch of fear. No locked doors, no mythical beasts. Just a place built to make you question where you were and what was waiting around the next corner. Knossos wasn't just an administrative center or royal residence. It was a place of worship, an architectural expression of the Minoan soul, steeped in ritual, myth, and divine mystery. Unlike later Greek temples, there are no towering columns to Zeus or marble shrines to Athena. Instead, the spiritual world of Knossos is more subtle, woven into the fabric of the building itself. Shrines hide in corners. Pillars rise like sacred sentinels. Horns, stylized, carved, symbolic, appear on rooftops and altars. Everywhere you look, the bull motif dominates, suggesting a powerful connection between worship, the natural world, and this revered animal. The Minoans didn't seem to fear the bull. They celebrated it. The famous bull leaping fresco in Knossos isn't just athletic art. It may depict a religious rite. Young men and women vaulting over a charging bull, locked in a dance of danger and grace. It wasn't sport, it was sacred theater, possibly an offering to the gods, or symbolic triumph over chaos. Then there are the snake goddesses. Discovered in storerooms beneath the palace, the snake goddess figurines are among the most iconic Minoan artifacts. Bare-breasted, arms raised, with serpents coiled in their hands or around their bodies. These figures radiate power. They are not submissive idols. They are guardians of the household, fertility, and perhaps life itself. To the Minoans, snakes symbolized renewal, rebirth, and mystery, creatures of both earth and underworld. The rooms where these objects were found hint at household shrines or ritual spaces. Quiet, sacred corners hidden among the palace's bustling heart, combined with the frescoes, the horns, the altars, and the labyrinthine corridors. The entire complex begins to feel like a ritual machine, a structure built not just for living, but for connecting with the divine. There is no centralized temple at Knossos because the palace itself was a temple. Its layout, art, and design were all part of a spiritual worldview where boundaries between sacred and secular didn't exist. This was a place where myth was architecture, where a corridor could become a passage to the gods, and where every echo in the stone chambers may have once been a whispered prayer. Knossos didn't just house people, it housed gods. For centuries, Knossos stood as a beacon of prosperity, innovation, and cultural sophistication. But then something happened, something sudden, something no one can fully explain. By around 1400 BCE, the palace was abandoned. The frescoes left to fade, and the Minoan civilization that once ruled the seas had vanished like mist over the Aegean. So what happened? Theories abound. Some point to nature. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, erupted in one of the largest explosions in human history. The blast was so massive it likely caused tsunamis that battered Crete's northern coast, devastating ports and farmland. Ash clouds may have blocked the sun, choking crops and disrupting the climate. While Knossos wasn't immediately destroyed, the aftermath of Thera's eruption may have shaken the foundations, economically, politically, and spiritually. Others looked to war. By 1450 BCE, the rising power of the Mycenaeans, mainland Greeks, may have taken advantage of Minoan weakness. Archaeological evidence suggests Knossos was reoccupied briefly, but the culture had changed. The art became more martial. Linear A, the Minoan script, was replaced with Linear B, used by Mycenaean scribes. The palace that once thrived with snake goddesses and bull dancers now whispered in a foreign tongue. Some scholars believe the Mycenaeans didn't invade in a single conquest, but gradually absorbed the island, first through trade, then influence, and finally rule. Others argue that internal collapse, a civil uprising, political instability, or the failure of the elite may have contributed just as much. What's striking, though, is how little violence is evident in the ruins. There are no charred skeletons, no signs of mass slaughter. Knossos didn't fall with a scream, it fell with a whisper. The great palatial system simply stopped. The rooms went quiet, the rituals ended, and nature slowly crept back in. By the time Homer sang of Crete in his epics, Knossos was already an ancient myth, a memory tangled in stories of kings, monsters, and labyrinths. And maybe that's fitting, because what killed Knossos wasn't just an eruption or invasion. It was time and the way of all great things, no matter how beautiful, eventually vanish beneath the weight of new empires. But the bones remain, and if you listen closely, the maze still hums beneath the earth. For thousands of years, Knossos lay buried beneath the Cretan soil, just another mound of stone lost to time, its name forgotten, its myths distorted, its walls swallowed by olive groves and dust. That is, until one man decided to chase a legend. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, and he didn't just rediscover Knossos, he reimagined it. In 1900, Evans, a British archaeologist with a flair for drama and a deep love for Homeric myth, purchased the land that covered the ancient ruins. Local farmers had been finding strange seals and artifacts, clues that something enormous lay beneath their feet. Evans dug in. What he found would change the history of the Aegean forever. He uncovered a palace so vast, so complex, and so advanced that he was convinced this was the mythical home of King Minos. The frescoes, the horns, the sheer architectural strangeness of the site. It all pointed in his mind to one thing, the labyrinth. Evans wasn't just an archaeologist, he was a storyteller, and sometimes a controversial one. He named the people who built Knossos the Minoans after Minos. He interpreted symbols, reconstructed frescoes, and restored parts of the palace using reinforced concrete, a move that has drawn both praise and criticism. Some call it visionary, others call it vandalism, because what you see today at Knossos is partly ancient ruins and partly Edwardian imagination. Still, Evans did what no one else had dared. He brought Knossos back to life. He gave Europe a glimpse into a Bronze Age world far older than classical Greece, a civilization of art, mystery, and maritime elegance. He also unearthed the still undeciphered Linear A script, opening new questions about language, literacy, and the limits of our historical understanding. But Evans did more than excavate stone. He resurrected a myth and forced historians to reckon with the fact that behind the legend of the labyrinth was something real, something complex, something very human. A palace that felt like a maze, a civilization that slipped into shadow, and a man who peeled back the earth only to discover a story far stranger and more beautiful than he had imagined. Knossos had slept for 3,000 years. Evans rang the bell that woke it up. Walk through Knossos, and you're not just walking through architecture, you're walking through a language of symbols. Frescoes, carvings, patterns. They're everywhere. But the Minoans didn't leave us a Rosetta Stone. Their primary script, Linear A, remains undeciphered. So instead of reading their thoughts, we must see them painted across plaster, carved into walls, and hidden in patterns. What exactly were they trying to say? The art of Knossos is unlike anything in the ancient world. There's no obsession with warfare, no rows of kings or battle-hardened heroes. Instead, we find nature, leaping dolphins, blooming lilies, birds in flight, and sacred bulls. The humans are lithe, elegant, and often dancing or performing rituals. Even in scenes that suggest danger, there's rhythm and beauty. The Minoans weren't chronicling conquests. They were celebrating life, cycles, and possibly cosmic order. The most iconic symbol, though, is the double axe or labris, found throughout Knossos and shrines on frescoes, even etched into stones. The double axe is believed to be a religious symbol, possibly tied to female divinity or celestial cycles. Some suggest the very word labyrinth might derive from labres, making the labyrinth not a maze at all, but a house of the double axe, a sacred space. Not a trap. Then there are the horns of consecration, stylized bull horns placed atop walls and altars. These may have been religious markers separating sacred space from the mundane. Combined with frequent depictions of bulls and bull leaping rituals, it's clear the animal had deep spiritual significance. Whether it represented nature, fertility, chaos, or a divine presence, no one agrees. But the bull is everywhere. Even the layout of Knossos may have symbolic meaning. Some archaeologists believe it was built not just for function, but to mirror celestial or seasonal patterns. Its winding corridors and nested rooms could represent a journey through life, through death, through the underworld, a spiritual maze, not a physical prison. But without a deciphered script, every theory walks a thin line between insight and imagination. The Minoans spoke in symbols, not stories, and so we're left to interpret. What is Knossos saying? We hear the rhythms, we see the images, but the meaning that remains just out of reach, like a thread unraveling into myth. Knossos is a ruin, yes, but it doesn't feel dead. Walk its corridors today, and you'll sense something humming just beneath the surface. Not ghosts, not gods, but echoes of myths of lives, of questions that refuse to go away. Thousands of years after its fall, Knossos still holds us in its maze. Tourists wander its halls, archaeologists dig for answers, and writers spin new tales inspired by its shadow. The Minotaur may be a myth, but the feeling of the labyrinth is real. We don't know who ruled Knossos. We don't know the names of its kings, queens, or priests. We don't know the prayers they whispered or the laws they lived by. But we know they loved beauty. We know they worshiped nature. We know they understood the balance between architecture and art, between ritual and reality. And we know they were the first. Before the Parthenon, before Rome, before the Hebrew temples or the Persian palaces, there was Knossos, a palace that was also a city that was also a temple that may have also been a story, because perhaps that's what the labyrinth really is. Not a prison, not a puzzle, but a narrative carved in stone, a myth in architectural form. The legend of the Minotaur didn't arise from nothing. It came from this place, from the confusion of its corridors, the reverence of its bull rituals, and the awe it inspired in generations who tried to make sense of it. The Greeks turned it into a story. We turned it into archaeology, but at its core, Knossos has always been both. Today, we can walk its ruins in broad daylight. We can take photos, draw maps, and even reconstruct its frescoes. But the mystery hasn't vanished. The line between fact and legend still shimmers like heat over stone. Maybe that's why Knossos endures, because it doesn't give us all the answers. It reminds us that sometimes history isn't meant to be solved, it's meant to be felt. And Knossos, ancient, tangled, half-remembered, isn't just a place on a map. It's a question, one that leads us deeper with every step. And like Theseus, we're all still following the thread. Ancient engineers knew exactly what they were doing. The earliest rams were handheld. Teams of soldiers simply lifted a tree trunk and smashed it against enemy defenses like frenzied lumberjacks. But over time, the battering ram evolved. Engineers realized that mounting the ram inside a wheeled frame, often with a roof to protect the crew from arrows and boiling oil, turned it from a tool into a weapon of terror. The Assyrians, masters of siege warfare, turned rams into psychological weapons. Their siege towers combined rams with archer platforms, meaning a city's gates were being destroyed while defenders were under constant fire. Relief carvings from Nineveh show rams with pointed iron tips rolling up to the gates of rebellious cities like slow-moving gods of destruction. And it wasn't just the front door they were smashing. Rams were often used to breach weak points in walls, batter down watchtowers, or collapse gatehouses entirely. Their presence meant one thing: surrender or watch your defenses crumble like stale bread. The Greeks refined them. The Romans perfected them. Roman engineers built massive rams called ares, Latin for ram, suspended with chains or ropes inside enormous siege shelters. Some were so big they needed dozens of men to operate, and the rhythm of their swinging beam was said to sound like thunder rolling across stone. And yet, for all their brute force, battering rams required serious teamwork. Operators had to keep the ram swinging in sync, while also defending it from burning missiles, stones, and all manner of foul substances hurled from above. A stalled ram was a dead ram. Still, when a battering ram got going, really going, it was unstoppable. Wooden muscle versus human masonry. It was ancient physics weaponized, and it was only the beginning of how engineers would make walls weak. If the battering ram was the brute, the catapult was the tactician where rams smashed close up. Catapults attacked from a distance, launching not just stones but psychological dread. They were the first real artillery pieces in military history, and they revolutionized siege warfare by weaponizing physics in ways that felt almost magical to the enemy. The earliest catapults emerged from the Greek world around the 4th century BC, a product of brilliant minds who wanted to add range and momentum to warfare. Dionysius the Fair of Syracuse, a tyrant with a taste for cutting-edge violence, commissioned the first torsion-powered catapults, devices that used twisted bundles of sinew or hair as tension springs. These weren't slingshots for giants. They were precise instruments of siege terror. The genius lay in their mechanics. Engineers figured out that by twisting ropes tightly, often made from animal sinew, they could store enormous amounts of potential energy when released. This force could hurl stones, javelins, or even flaming projectiles hundreds of meters. The two main types evolved quickly. The ballista, which launched massive bolts like a giant crossbow, and the stone-throwing catapult, which lobbed boulders over walls or directly at fortifications. Then came the Roman engineers, who never met a Greek idea they couldn't improve. They built catapults that could be broken down, packed onto carts, and reassembled on site. Portable siege engines for professional armies. Some Roman catapults could fire 60 lb stones at incredible speeds, capable of tearing through wooden gates, battlements, and occasionally unlucky soldiers. Catapults weren't just about destruction, they were about spectacle. Ancient generals used them to send messages, sometimes literally. Corpses were launched over walls to spread disease and fear. Severed heads were lobbed into besieged cities to shatter morale. In one chilling case, diseased bodies were fired into enemy territory as an early form of biological warfare. But catapults had their flaws. They were heavy, required skilled crews, and could be rendered useless by bad terrain. Still, when set up properly, they could batter a city into submission from a safe distance. And for the first time in history, cities realized their thick stone walls didn't just need to withstand a ram. They had to survive the skies. Because now destruction came flying. If the catapult was clever, the trebuchet was majestic, towering, creaking, and terrifying. It was the undisputed king of medieval siege warfare. When one appeared on the battlefield, it wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement. It said your walls mean nothing. Unlike its tension-powered cousins, the trebuchet relied on gravity. At its core was a simple principle: a long swinging arm mounted on a sturdy frame with a heavy counterweight on one end and a sling on the other. Raise the weight, let it drop, and the arm would whip around, flinging the sling and its deadly payload in a high arc over enemy defenses. It was controlled destruction, precise, predictable, and devastating. The origin of the trebuchet can be traced back to earlier traction models used by the Chinese as early as the 4th century BCE, where manpower replaced counterweights. But the counterweight trebuchet, the version that would rewrite siege warfare in Europe and the Islamic world, emerged in the 12th century, possibly through Byzantine or Muslim intermediaries. Once Europe got its hands on the design, it spread like wildfire through castles and crusades. The power was astonishing. A well-built trebuchet could launch 300 lb projectiles over 300 meters. Stones the size of furniture would crash into towers, pulverize walls, or crater enemy morale. But the real magic was in the arc. Unlike catapults, trebuchets could hurl projectiles over walls with finesse. This meant they weren't just smashing defenses, they were hitting courtyards, barracks, and supply depots inside. And it wasn't just stones. Trebuchets hurled everything. Diseased animals, burning pitch, pots of lime to blind defenders, even messages or insults wrapped around rocks. One legendary account from the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland tells of Warwolf, a trebuchet so massive that the enemy surrendered before it was even fired. The king refused to accept the surrender, just so he could test the machine. But for all its destructive glory, the trebuchet wasn't fast. It took hours to build, minutes to reload, and demanded skilled engineers. Still, no other siege weapon combined range force and psychological horror quite like it. It was the medieval version of a slow-motion hammer from the heavens. And when that counterweight dropped, cities held their breath. While catapults launched from afar and battering rams smashed the gates, siege towers took a more personal approach. They rolled right up to the enemy's front door and dropped off armed invaders. Imagine a wooden skyscraper on wheels, covered in wet hides to prevent fire, bristling with archers and spearmen. That was the siege tower, the ancient equivalent of an armored personnel carrier and a mobile fortress in one. And when one of these started rumbling toward your city walls, you knew that the real fight was about to begin. Siege towers weren't subtle. They were big, bold, and terrifyingly effective when used properly. The Assyrians may have been among the first to deploy them in the 9th century BCE, but it was the Greeks, and especially the Hellenistic kingdoms, that took the design to theatrical extremes. During the siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE, the Macedonian general Demetrius built a 9-story tower called the Helepolis, or Taker of Cities. It was over 100 feet tall, equipped with catapults covered in iron plates and moved by thousands of soldiers. It also broke under its own weight, but the ambition was unmatched. The logic behind siege towers was simple. Walls only work if you can't get over them. Siege towers eliminated that advantage by creating an elevated platform from which attackers could descend onto the battlements, bypassing gates and scaling ladders. From the top deck, archers could rain death down onto defenders while troops on the lower levels prepared to board. But these towers weren't invincible. They were slow, vulnerable to mud, and prime targets for defenders with fire arrows, rolling boulders, or even sabotage terrain. Smart defenders would dig ditches, flood moats, or build secondary inner walls, known as counterscarp defenses, just to stop a tower's approach. Still, when they worked spectacularly. A breach in the wall was one thing, but having your own rampart suddenly crowded with enemy soldiers, that was chaos. Siege towers transformed the battlefield from a horizontal contest of strength to a vertical race for survival. They made height an asset and a liability, and once the gangplank dropped from a siege tower to the city walls, there was no turning back. It was time for hand-to-hand hell. While rams smashed and trebuchets soared, some of the most devastating siege tactics happened silently underground. Siege tunneling, or sapping, was the dark art of defeating a city by removing the ground it stood on. Literally, the idea was ancient and horrifyingly effective. Dig beneath the enemy's wall, prop it up with wooden supports, then set those supports on fire. When the timbers burned away, the tunnel collapsed, taking the foundation of the wall with it. One moment, your city stood strong. The next, a massive section of the outer wall crumbled like stale bread. This method didn't look glorious. There were no grand engines or thunderous launches, but tunneling was the slow, invisible killer of fortress warfare. The Assyrians practiced early versions of it, but the technique reached full maturity with the Greeks, Persians, and later medieval European armies. During the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE, the Spartans attempted tunneling beneath the walls only for the defenders to dig counter tunnels and intercept the mid-dig, turning the soil into a knife-fight nightmare. This defensive tactic became known as counter-mining, and it added an eerie element to siege warfare. Imagine soldiers digging in pitch black, hundreds of feet beneath the earth, listening for the sound of enemy picks. The moment they heard tapping, they'd race to intercept, often resulting in violent claustrophobic skirmishes fought by torchlight with knives and shovels. There was no glory in it, just terror, suffocation, and dirt. But when undermining worked, the results were catastrophic. One of the most infamous examples came on December 12th during the siege of Rochester Castle in England. King John's forces tunneled beneath the southern wall, packed the mine with pig fat, and set it ablaze. The supports collapsed, bringing down the entire tower above. The defenders were stunned and soon after surrendered. By the 13th century, Siege engineers became specialists in identifying weak foundations, measuring the soil's behavior, and planning collapses with terrifying precision. They were geologists and demolitionists rolled into one. And though tunneling required time, labor, and a bit of madness, it proved one truth about siege warfare. If you couldn't go over the wall and you couldn't go through it, you could always take it down from below. Not all the drama of siege warfare came from the attackers. For every ram built or tower rolled forward, defenders had their own deadly tricks, and sometimes those tricks were hot. Let's start with the most terrifying of them all, Greek fire. Developed by the Byzantines around the 7th century CE, Greek fire was a mysterious napalm-like substance that could stick to ships, walls, and flesh, and kept burning even on water. Sprayed from siphons or hurled in clay pots, it created scenes of pure chaos. To this day, no one knows exactly how it was made. The formula was so secret that it died with the empire. But its effects? Legendary. Entire fleets were reduced to flaming skeletons within minutes, and that was just the start. In more low-tech defenses, boiling liquids were the go-to weapons of choice. Boiling water, oil, or sand would be poured from murder holes, those quaint openings in the ceilings of gateways or towers directly onto invaders below. Oil was especially feared. Unlike water, it clung to skin, soaking into clothes and armor before being set alight. Imagine climbing a siege ladder only to be greeted with fire you could never put out. Hot sand, though less dramatic, was vicious in its own right. It would slip into the gaps of armor, especially around the neck or wrists, causing second and third degree burns as it cooked the flesh beneath. It didn't look impressive from a distance, but it turned bold warriors into screaming wrecks in seconds. Defenders also relied on the good old laws of physics. Gravity became a weapon. Giant stones, logs, or even dead animals were dropped from parapets onto siege engines or dense formations of troops. The goal wasn't just to kill. It was to break the machines and morale at once. And then there were traps, hidden pits, collapsing bridges, spiked barricades. Castles became puzzles of pain, designed to slow, confuse, and punish. All of this served one purpose: delay. Every minute a wall held was a minute closer to enemy supply lines running thin, to disease spreading in camps, or to reinforcements arriving. Siege warfare was a game of attrition. And while the attackers had physics on their side, the defenders had creativity and a whole lot of boiling rage. In siege warfare, raw destruction was only half the goal. The other half was psychological domination, breaking the will of the defenders before the walls even came down. Siege weapons weren't just tools of war. They were massive, creaking, flaming symbols of doom. Every groaning wheel of a siege tower, every arcing boulder flung by a trebuchet, was designed to plant one seed in the minds of those behind the walls. You are not safe. Ancient commanders knew this. The Assyrians paraded their siege engines openly, dragging them across deserts with grand fanfare. The Romans built their siege camps right in view of the enemy, letting defenders watch as battering rams were assembled and catapults tested. Siege was theater, and fear was part of the script. Sometimes the payloads themselves carried a message. Severed heads of messengers or generals would be launched over the walls, often still wearing their armor. At the siege of Constantinople, defenders were bombarded not only with rocks but with bodies, diseased corpses launched to spread panic and plague. During the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, it's believed that hurling plague-infected corpses over the walls helped trigger outbreaks of the Black Death in Europe. The trebuchet wasn't just a weapon. It was an announcement. When one of these giants was rolled into place, everyone inside the fortress could hear it before they saw it. The creaking of winches, the grinding of ropes, the heavy thunk of the counterweight, like the heartbeat of an incoming storm. But the most dangerous part, the unknown. You never knew what was coming next. Would it be a rock? Barrel of fire? A rain of arrows? Or just silence? Ominous. Heavy silence as engineers adjusted their aim. Even the sounds became psychological weapons. The rhythmic thump of a battering ram or the sudden silence before a shot would drive defenders mad with anticipation. For commanders, the goal was to create despair, to convince the enemy that resistance was pointless, that their gods had abandoned them, that their walls were nothing but temporary obstacles in the path of fate. And when that mental dam finally cracked, The gates often open without a fight, because in siege warfare, sometimes the mine collapsed before the masonry. As gunpowder thundered onto the battlefield in the late medieval era, the age of traditional siege engines came to a slow, splintering end. But their legacy didn't vanish. It evolved. The invention of cannons changed everything. A single well-placed shot from a cannon could do in seconds what a trebuchet took hours to achieve. Stone walls, once considered impenetrable, became liabilities. By the 15th century, the great castles of Europe were crumbling not from undermining or fire, but from iron balls crashing through their parapets. Siege warfare had entered its next phase, explosive, brutal, and deafening. And yet the principles laid down by ancient siege engineers never disappeared. Modern artillery still owes a debt to the catapult and trebuchet. Every ballistic missile and long-range howitzer is just a high-tech descendant of the same question. How do you break what's meant to be unbreakable from a distance? Physics, trajectory, tension, and force, all discovered, tested, and perfected centuries before gunpowder ever entered the story. Even military psychology today, shock and awe, overwhelming firepower. Visible dominance has its roots in ancient siege tactics. Those towering siege engines rolling forward with flags snapping in a wind with the original shock and awe. They weren't just about breaching a wall. They were about breaking the spirit of a city. You can still see their legacy etched into the ruins of ancient cities at Masada, where Roman siege ramps still scar the desert at Constantinople, where layers of walls stood for 1,000 years against every machine imaginable, until cannon fire finally brought them down at castles across Europe, where round towers and angled bastions tell the story of a world constantly redesigning itself to survive the next siege. And today, even in a world of drones and satellite-guided missiles, siege warfare hasn't vanished. It's just gone digital. Cities are still surrounded. Defenders are still isolated. Walls are now firewalls, blockades, or even media blackouts. But the soul of the siege remains the same. Someone wants in, someone wants to keep them out, and both are willing to wait, build, and break to win. The battering rams are gone. The trebuchets are museum pieces, but the spirit of siege warfare, it's as alive and as destructive as ever. Welcome to ancient Egypt, land of pyramids, gods, and relentless ultraviolet violence before you even open your eyes. The sun is already blasting through your reed hut like it's auditioning for the role of unforgiving sky god. There are no curtains, no shades, and certainly no air conditioning. Just the raw, unforgiving heat of the desert, baking everything, including you, by breakfast. You're lying on a straw mat with a linen sheet that's more suggestion than protection. The Nile breeze you were promised in all those travel documentaries? Yeah, it's gone. Probably died sometime around 2800 BC. By the time you stumble outside, the temperature is already flirting with 90 degrees Fahrenheit, or around 32 Celsius, and it's not even mid-morning. The sun doesn't just shine in ancient Egypt. It attacks your linen tunic. Useless. It's like wearing tissue paper in a sauna. And don't even think about sunscreen. There's no aloe vera, no SPF 50, not even a floppy hat with a logo from a beach resort. Ancient Egyptians did have protective oils, but unless you're wealthy or work in a temple, you're not getting any of it. Your best option? Smear yourself with mud or crocodile dung, which apparently might keep you from turning into a human torch. Emphasis on might. By midday, the stones under your feet are hot enough to cook lentils. Shade is a luxury. Trees are rare. You might get a little relief hiding behind a mud brick wall, but even that wall is sweating by now. You, on the other hand, look like someone threw you into a clay oven and forgot to set a timer. And you better not complain. Alright, the sun god is watching. And in ancient Egypt, the sun wasn't just weather, it was divine authority. The hotter the day, the more powerful Ra was feeling. So basically, if you're melting, it's a spiritual compliment. In short, surviving one day in ancient Egypt requires hydration, humility, and an ironclad tolerance for feeling like a roast chicken. And this is just the morning you're finally out of bed. Or rather, off your scratchy straw mat. And the good news is the Nile is just a short walk away. The bad news, you can already smell it before you see it. Yes, the mighty Nile, the life giver of ancient Egypt, revered as sacred. the reason civilization here even exists. But let's be honest, it also smells like a fish market had a bad breakup with a swamp. The banks are buzzing with flies, frogs, and things that probably shouldn't have legs but do. Still, this is where you bathe. Soap hasn't been invented yet, and even if it had, you couldn't afford it. Instead, you lather yourself in the freshest cleansing technology of the day, sand. That's right, exfoliation. The Egyptian way. Just rub yourself down with coarse grains and call it skincare. It's like nature's sandpaper, but less effective. Washing clothes. Also done in the Nile. And by washing, we mean pounding them against rocks while praying that a crocodile doesn't mistake your laundry for a tasty midday snack. Oh, and just to make things more fun, let's not forget the occasional sewage runoff from upstream. Remember, people, livestock, and the occasional funeral boat all share this river. And yet, somehow, this is considered clean. You scrub, rinse, and emerge feeling slightly less sticky and only moderately more worried about leeches. If you're a city dweller in Memphis or Thebes, you might be lucky enough to use a public basin or cistern, but for everyone else, it's Nile or nothing, and don't expect privacy. This is a public bathing space shared by families, neighbors, livestock, and the odd ibis pecking around your ankles like it pays rent. Water jars are filled and balanced on heads, carried back to your mud brick house before the midday heat turns the clay into toast. It's a daily ritual, spiritual, necessary, and slightly traumatic. So yes, the Nile is sacred. It feeds you, cleans you, and quenches your thirst. But let's not pretend it's a sparkling oasis. In reality, it's part miracle, part biohazard, and all you've got. By now you've bathed in the crocodile-infested Nile, you've sandpapered yourself semi-clean, and your body feels like a baked fig. Time for breakfast, the most important and least glamorous meal of your ancient Egyptian day. Let's set expectations. There are no eggs Benedict, no fruit bowls, and absolutely no iced lattes. Breakfast in ancient Egypt is less of a culinary event and more of a tactical refueling operation. You sit on a low stool if you have one, or just squat in the corner like everyone else. The centerpiece of your meal, bread, lots of it, dense, coarse, and often as chewy as a leather sandal. It's made from emmer wheat or barley and baked in clay ovens that may or may not be shared by the local rats. And don't be surprised if there's sand in your slice. Not as a topping, just an uninvited ingredient from the grinding stones. A daily dose of minerals, you could say. Then comes the beer. But don't get excited. This isn't crisp, bubbly craft ale. This is thick, cloudy, lukewarm liquid bread. More porridge than pine. It's packed with calories and vaguely fermented. A medieval smoothie with a faint taste of sour cereal and survival. Even children drink it. Not to be edgy, but because it's safer than water. At least the brewing process boils out the parasites, unlike the Nile, which we just discussed is basically a petri dish. If you're lucky, and we mean very lucky, you might get an onion or a few dry dates to go with your carbon foam combo. Protein only if someone caught a fish and didn't immediately eat it raw. And as you chew your rock like loaf and sip your grain sludge, flies buzz around you like it's a buffet. Because it is for them. You sweat at them with one hand, hold your cup with the other. Try not to think too hard about the fact that this is likely the best meal you'll have today. Breakfast in ancient Egypt isn't about flavor, it's about function. It fuels your body just enough to survive until the next time someone hands you another sand-infused brick of bread. Bon appetit. You've had your gritty bread, your chunky beer, and just enough rest to call yourself functional. Now it's time to work. And trust me, ancient Egyptian labor makes modern burnout look like a spa day. Unless you're a scribe, priest, or royalty, which, let's be honest, you're not. Your job is pure muscle and dust. No air-conditioned cubicle, no coffee breaks, no ergonomic chairs. Just sweat, sand, and a constant risk of collapsing before noon. If you're a farmer, you'll be ankle-deep in Nile mud by sunrise, yanking weeds or planting barley under the eye of an overseer whose hobby seems to be yelling. You use wooden plows, crude sickles, and your bare hands. If your back hurts, congratulations, that means it's working. If you're a laborer, things get even more biblical. Imagine hauling multi-ton stones for temple construction under a blazing sun, while barefoot, up ramps made of gravel and prayer. There's no OSHA here. You trip. That's a broken ankle and a shrug from the foreman. Working on tombs? That's another level of grind. You're hammering limestone, chiseling out burial chambers for people who'll get to rest longer than you ever will. And if you mess up a pharaoh's tomb, let's just say job security might involve a sealed chamber and a curse. And if you're a woman, you're not off the hook. Domestic work is also physical labor, grinding grain, hauling water, weaving linen, caring for kids, and still helping in the fields. Your break is when the baby naps for 7 minutes. While you prepare dinner, you eat on the go. You wipe sweat with your tunic. You keep moving. Because slowing down means falling behind, and falling behind means someone else gets your grain quota and you get the blame. There's no clocking out. The sun is your supervisor. When it finally sinks behind the horizon, you crawl home half alive, dust-caked and dreaming of softer sandals and a less aggressive sun god. Work in ancient Egypt isn't just hard, it's endless. It's a full-body commitment to survival day after day, until your body gives out or your overseer decides you're not worth feeding. And that's not even the worst of it. After sweating your soul out in the fields or a quarry, you might be tempted to grumble. Maybe something small. This job stinks. Or why am I doing this again? Stop right there. Because in ancient Egypt, complaining isn't just frowned upon. It's potentially treason. Why? Because your boss isn't just a ruler. He's a literal god. The pharaoh isn't some guy who got elected or born into a lucky family. He's the human embodiment of Horus, son of Are, chosen by the heavens to rule over Egypt and keep Mot divine cosmic order intact. In other words, if the river floods well this year, thank the pharaoh. If it doesn't, well, maybe you didn't pray hard enough. Questioning his authority isn't just rude, it's blasphemy. Speaking ill of him could land you a date with a whip, a set of shackles, or an early trip to the underworld with none of your favorite burial goods. You see his face everywhere, on statues, temple walls, coins, even bread molds. His name is chanted in rituals. His image is painted larger than everyone else's in every mural. That's not artistic exaggeration. That's the law. And don't expect to ever see him if you're a commoner. The closest you'll get is watching a golden bark float by during a religious festival. Blink and he's gone back to a palace you'll never enter, surrounded by officials, guards, scribes, and enough gold to finance a small civilization. Which, fun fact, he basically does. If you're lucky enough to work on a royal project, say a tomb, a temple, or a statue the size of a mountain, you serve with divine joy. At least that's what the state says. You say it too, because pretending you're honored to carve stone for 14 hours a day is safer than the alternative. And don't even think about rebellion. Pharaohs crush uprisings faster than you can say dynasty. Just ask the last village that tried to withhold taxes. Oh wait, you can't. It no longer exists. So yes, the pharaoh is divine. And you're just lucky to be allowed to sweat in his name. Now get back to work. If you thought surviving under the sun was hard, just wait until you realize that in ancient Egypt, sand is your roommate, coworker, seasoning, and mortal enemy. It's everywhere. In your clothes, in your bed, in your food. There is no escaping it. You could be working, praying, sleeping, or minding your own business in the market, and suddenly, a gust of hot wind sweeps by and turns your face into a grainy exfoliation experiment you didn't ask for. Let's start with the clothes. You wear linen. It's light, breathable, and about as effective at keeping sand out as a screen door is at holding back soup. It slides down your tunic, clings to your skin, and somehow finds its way into places you didn't know had creases. Easy. Good luck. Every loaf of bread is basically a sand trap. Since flour was ground between stone slabs, little bits of grit made their way into the dough. Egyptians didn't just eat their wheat, they ate their millstones too. It's why ancient dental remains are often worn flat like river rocks. Imagine chewing your breakfast while also filing your molars daily. And if you thought your house was a sand-free zone, think again. Your mud brick home has gaps, crevices. and windows with no glass. Perfect portals for wind-blown sand. Your floors are covered. Your cooking pots are full. Your bed is basically a sand pit disguised as furniture. Shoes? Optional at best. Most Egyptians walked barefoot, meaning you're always one step away from turning your feet into battered leather sandals. If you do have footwear, it's usually a basic pair of sandals made from reeds. Fashionable, perhaps. Protective. Not remotely. Then there are sandstorms. Egypt's version of a slap from the gods. Sudden, swirling, blinding. One moment you're talking to a friend, the next you're spitting dust and feeling like someone dumped an entire beach into your eye sockets. Visibility drops to zero, and everyone around you turns into vaguely coughing silhouettes. In short, sand is the roommate who never leaves the spice in every meal, and the silent enemy of your eyes, lungs, and dignity. It's not just the backdrop of your life. It's part of your body now. And no, you can't wash it off. You already tried in the Nile, which is probably full of more sand. In ancient Egypt, religion isn't just a weekend activity. It's the operating system for everything. Your job, your diet, your hygiene routine, your bedtime rituals, all dictated by gods who seem to have very specific opinions. First, understand this. The gods are everywhere. Your town has temples to a dozen different deities, each responsible for some vital function. There's Ra, who pilots the sun across the sky like it's a divine Uber. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, is in charge of scribes and moon calendars. Sobuk, part crocodile, part nightmare fuel, guards the Nile, and Batet, the cat goddess, basically runs public relations. Forget personal freedom. Your daily routine revolves around pleasing them. Wake up, thank Ra, spill some beer, apologize to Hathor, stub your toe, curse quietly, or risk attracting a spirit with a grudge. Before meals, you offer a bit of food to the gods. Before bed, you pray that Set, god of chaos, doesn't toss your house into existential disarray overnight. Even funerals are multi-day affairs where the deceased must pass tests, avoid demons and prove they were morally decent, or risk eternal erasure. Speaking of the afterlife, ancient Egyptians took it very seriously. You don't just die and move on. You must pass a judgment process involving your heart being weighed against a feather of truth. If your heart's heavier because of lies, cruelty, or maybe stealing someone's goat, you're eaten by Ammit, a creature with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the legs of your worst nightmare. So yes, even in death, you're still on probation. But here's the twist. This complex belief system isn't depressing. It's comforting. Egyptians believed life was part of a cosmic balance, and if you followed the rituals and upheld Ma'at, the principle of truth and order, you had a chance at a peaceful eternity, complete with food, family, and maybe a boat. Of course, the richer you are, the more gods seem to notice you. Temples were massive, priests were powerful, and peasants, well, they just hoped the gods were feeling generous that day. Because in ancient Egypt, faith isn't optional. It's your job description, your insurance plan, and your travel itinerary for the next life. So you stepped on something sharp, got bit by something weird, or caught something contagious, which in ancient Egypt is basically Tuesday. Time to seek medical care. Just don't expect a waiting room or a sterile environment. You're about to be healed with a combination of spells, herbs, and sheer optimism. First, you'll be taken to a doctor. And to be fair, they were some of the most advanced in the ancient world. They had surgical tools, medical techs, and a decent understanding of anatomy. But here's the catch. Science in ancient Egypt always came with a heavy dose of magic. You're given a poultice made of honey, moldy bread, and crushed herbs. Honey actually is antibacterial, and mold has early penicillin properties. So it works. Sort of. But before applying it, the healer will chant a protective spell just to be safe, because you never know when your stomach cramps are actually the result of a spiteful ghost or an angry god. Have a headache? You might get a dose of crushed onions rubbed into your scalp while someone recites a hymn to Thoth. Got a cough? Let's smear cow dung mixed with dates on your chest and see what happens. Eye infection. Time for a paste of lizard blood, ochre, and beer, plus a prayer to Horus. Surgery. It did happen sometimes. Abscesses were drained, bones were set, and wounds were stitched with linen thread. But there's no anesthesia. Just a sharp knife and a friend to hold your shoulders down while you scream into a mud brick pillow. Dentistry. Not great. Remember all that sand in the bread? Your teeth are worn down by your 20s. If one gets infected, your options are 1, live with it; 2, die from it; or 3, have it pulled with something resembling pliers made by a blacksmith with low standards. And let's not forget the amulets, whether you're giving birth, getting stitched up, or just sneezing too loud. A good doctor/priest will probably hang a charm around your neck, just in case the real issue is an invisible serpent spirit curled around your spleen. So yes, Egyptian medicine had its moments, but mostly you'd better believe in the gods because your band-aid is literally a prayer. Here's a plot twist most people don't expect. Ancient Egyptian women had more rights than many women in later civilizations. They could own property, run businesses, file for divorce, and even take a man to court. Sounds progressive, right? But before you pack your bags for a time-traveling girl boss vacation, hold up. Because while the legal status might impress you, the day-to-day reality is not so glamorous. If you're a woman in ancient Egypt, you probably wake up before sunrise. You're grinding grain by hand, using a giant flat stone that chews through both wheat and your spine. Then it's off to haul water from the Nile, cook breakfast, care for children, manage the household, feed animals, and if needed, help in the fields. You're a one-woman workforce in linen. There's no me time, no spa days, and definitely no maternity leave. Childbirth is risky and painful. Midwives are helpful, sure, but there are no epidurals, no disinfectant, and no push playlists featuring relaxing harps. You give birth in a hot room with incense, prayers, and hopefully not too much bleeding. Let's talk about fashion. Linen dresses are light and breathable, but there's no underwear and no shoes. The sun scorches your skin, the sand grinds into everything, and the bugs think you're an all-you-can-eat buffet. Want makeup? Great. Egyptian women did wear cosmetics, but it's lead-based and applied with sticks that look suspiciously like toothpicks. Now, if you're lucky enough to be born into a wealthy family, things are better. You might read, write, manage estate accounts, or become a priestess. If you're born royal, you could even become pharaoh like Hatshepsut or Cleopatra, who ruled with brilliance and terrifying eyeliner. But if you're poor, your status may be legal. But your reality is physical. You work, sweat, bend, carry, birth, bury, and pray. You're not chained by law, but by survival. Still, Egyptian women had agency, and that mattered. They could speak in court, keep their inheritance, and didn't become property when they married. Compared to many ancient societies, that's huge. So yes, Egyptian women had rights, but comfort. That is reserved for staff, statues, and goddesses, not the woman elbow deep in dough while swatting flies off a toddler. You made it through another grueling day in ancient Egypt. You ate your gritty bread, hauled your buckets, avoided divine wrath, and maybe even dodged a sandstorm. Time to relax, right? Wrong. Because in ancient Egypt, your real test begins after you die. Death isn't the end. It's just the beginning of an incredibly bureaucratic, multi-phase journey through the underworld. And if you thought the labor overseer was strict, wait until you meet the gods of judgment. First, your soul takes a trip to the Hall of Ma'at. Here, before a tribunal of 42 deities, you must proclaim your innocence in what's basically the oldest legal deposition in history. You say things like, "I did not steal, I did not lie, I did not covet my neighbor's donkey," all while hoping the gods buy it. Then comes the heart test, literally. Your heart, believed to be the seat of the soul, is placed on a scale opposite the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth, justice, and balance. If your heart is heavier than the feather, well, that means you've lived a wicked life. Enter Ammit, part lion, part crocodile, part hippo, all terrifying. She doesn't arrest you. She doesn't find you. She eats your soul, destroying it forever. No afterlife, no second chances, just eternal non-existence, which, in a culture obsessed with eternity, is the ultimate punishment. And it gets better. You can doom yourself not just by actions, but by words. One wrong confession, one forgotten line during your judgment, and boom, spiritual obliteration. It's like an open book test where failure means getting devoured by a mythological death hybrid. If you do pass, congratulations. You get to enter the field of reeds, a peaceful, idealized version of Egypt where your soul lives forever, with boats, with crops, with family, and presumably with fewer sand fleas. But the stakes? Enormous. That's why Egyptians are obsessed over tomb preparation, funeral rites, and magical texts like the Book of the Dead, a spiritual cheat sheet full of prayers, spells, and helpful tips like don't insult the crocodile god. So yes, the afterlife might be beautiful, but only if you live your life very carefully. One curse word, one unpaid temple tax, and your next stop is lunch for a minute. Sleep tight. If there's one small mercy in ancient Egypt, it's this linen. Blessed, breathable linen. Your entire wardrobe and everyone else's is made from this plant-based fabric. It's light, cool, and lets your skin breathe in the scorching heat. That's the good news. The bad news, that's pretty much where the comfort ends. Whether you're a farmer, builder, priest, or vendor, you're wearing the same outfit every day. For men, a short white kilt or loincloth. For women, a straight, sleeveless linen dress, sometimes held up by straps, sometimes not. If you're upper class, you might have pleats or beads or fancy patterns. If you're not, it's plain white or slightly grayish, depending on how long it's been since laundry day. Oh, and laundry day. Your hands scrubbing your clothes in an aisle while hoping a hippo doesn't emerge mid-rinse. Underwear optional. Footwear is also optional. Most people go barefoot. Sandals made from woven reeds or leather are reserved for special occasions or temple priests, so unless you're royalty, expect to spend your days with hot sand between your toes and possibly a sharp rock in your heel. Accessories? Absolutely, but mostly functional. Amulets for protection, necklaces to show status, and eye makeup made from powdered coal, which wasn't just for fashion. It helped reduce glare from the sun and supposedly warded off infections. Yes, even eyeliner had a job in ancient Egypt. But no matter how well you dress, the bugs don't care. Flies, gnats, mosquitoes. They treat your airy outfit as an invitation. You're walking through the day, swatting constantly, rubbing on perfumed oils, and praying that your linen doesn't stick to you like a wet curtain the moment the sun reaches full strength. And of course, your outfit doesn't change with the seasons because Egypt doesn't really have seasons, just hot and slightly less hot. So your linen ensemble is basically your year-round uniform, whether it's 110 degrees or a chilly 70-degree evening. So yes, Egyptian clothing was light, elegant, and far more comfortable than what Romans would wear later. But don't let the breezy outfits fool you, because no matter how floaty your tunic feels, your life is still heavy with labor, heat, sand, and bugs that refuse to respect your personal space. You've survived another blistering Egyptian day, hauling bricks, dodging sandstorms, and praying your linen doesn't disintegrate mid-task. But in ancient Egypt, survival is always temporary, because no matter how tough you are, you probably won't live past 35. Let's break it down. If you make it past childhood, which is already an achievement, considering infant mortality rates were sky high, you're thrust straight into adulthood by age 13. Marriage, work, and child rearing all start early because honestly, you're running out of time. You might die from heat stroke, or an infected cut, or childbirth, or crocodiles, or scorpion stings, or bad bread. And forget antibiotics. If you get a fever, the best treatment is honey, herbs, and hoping the gods don't have other plans for your soul. But here's the twist. Egyptians weren't scared of death. They planned for it. In fact, they planned for it better than most people plan for retirement today. If you're rich, you commission a tomb, the ancient version of a 5-star eternity suite. You start saving up grave goods, jewelry, food offerings, perfumes, statues, even tiny servant dolls called shabtais to do your chores in the afterlife. Think of them as spiritual interns who work while you nap forever. Your body is embalmed, wrapped in linen, stuffed with natron, natural salt, and tucked neatly into a painted sarcophagus. You're buried with a copy of the Book of the Dead, which is less about doom and more like a mystical travel guide, complete with passwords for the afterlife, spells to confuse demons, and instructions for not getting eaten by soul-devouring monsters. If you're poor, well, your tomb is likely a shallow pit in the sand. Your body is wrapped in whatever fabric your family can spare, maybe a pot or two placed nearby, and then covered with earth. No murals, no golden mass, just you and the wind. But even the poorest Egyptians held on to the dream of the afterlife, a peaceful, fertile paradise called the Field of Reeds, where you farm without sweat, eat without hunger, and sail the Nile forever under gentle sunlight. So yes, you'll probably die young in ancient Egypt. But if you lived well, prayed right, and didn't insult too many jackal-headed gods, you just might spend eternity in style. You finally made it to the afterlife, or at least into the tomb. You've been embalmed, wrapped, blessed, and buried. Time to rest in peace, right? Well, not exactly, because in ancient Egypt, even the dead get robbed. Let's start with a simple truth. Tombs are full of expensive stuff. Gold amulets, jewelry, perfumed oils, carved statues, chests full of linens, and for pharaohs, literal boatloads of treasure, all intended to be taken into the afterlife. But treasure in a tomb is basically an open invitation for someone with a chisel and bad intentions. Tomb robbery was so common that it became a full-time problem. Pharaohs tried to fight it by hiding their tombs deep in cliffs, locking them behind trap doors and scrawling terrifying curses on the walls. Things like "May a crocodile devour your soul," or "May your limbs be twisted forever by a serpent made of fire." Spoiler: the curses didn't work. Grave robbers came anyway at night in secret, with inside knowledge. Sometimes they were locals, sometimes they were corrupt workers who helped build the tombs. In some cases, even priests and guards were on it. And the punishment for getting caught? Severe. Think public beatings, mutilation, exile, or death. But considering how valuable tomb goods were, especially gold and rare incense, the risk often seemed worth it. After all, the dead don't fight back. But it's not just the wealthy who got robbed. Even commoners' graves were disturbed. Poor Egyptians might have been buried with a small pot of beer or a loaf of bread for the afterlife. That was still worth stealing. Food was scarce, tools were valuable, and linen was currency. The irony? Tomb robbing wasn't just about greed. Sometimes it was about survival. Egypt went through famines, political collapse, and invasions. A hungry worker might break into a tomb, not for treasure, but for food. And when your children are starving, a few funeral offerings look less like sacred objects and more like dinner. So in ancient Egypt, you're not safe just because you're dead. Your tomb can be looted, your name erased, and your mummy unwrapped by some desperate soul with a pickaxe and poor moral judgment. Rest in peace, only if no one knows where you're buried. We've all seen them, those majestic, mysterious carvings on the walls of temples and tombs. Birds, eyes, snakes, lotus flowers, men walking sideways like they're on a fashion runway. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Visually stunning and insanely difficult to learn. Sure, they look cool, but try reading them. Hieroglyphs weren't just decorative art. They were a full-blown writing system with over 700 characters and growing. Some symbols represent entire words, others are sounds, and many are determinatives which clarify meaning. Because, writing the word star with an actual star symbol might be too straightforward. And don't expect spaces or punctuation. Ancient Egyptian writing was basically one long, beautiful riddle with artistic flair, zero vowels, and a deep need for context. Oh, and it can be written left to right to left, or top to bottom, depending on what the scribe felt like that day. The trick? Look at which way the birds or people are facing. That's your reading direction. If they're facing right, read right, facing left, read left, and if they're upside down, good luck. Learning to write hieroglyphs wasn't for commoners. Literacy was rare. Maybe 1% of the population could actually read and write. If you wanted it in, you had to become a scribe, which meant years of intense education. Starting as a child, you'd memorize hundreds of symbols, copy endless scrolls, and practice so much that your hand probably curled into a claw by age 15. But the payoff? Huge. Scribes were respected, well-fed, and never made to haul bricks under the sun. Instead, they wrote tax records, court documents, letters, and religious texts. They were essential to society and protected from most manual labor. In a world where writing was power, scribes ruled quietly from the shadows. For the rest of the population, though, writing was something magical. Literally, hieroglyphs were believed to have sacred power. Writing someone's name preserved their soul, erasing it. Total spiritual annihilation. So yeah, spelling really mattered. So while hieroglyphs may look like ancient emoji, they're more like a linguistic Rubik's Cube wrapped in myth, math, and mystery. Beautiful. Yes. Easy to learn? Absolutely not. After 14 chapters of heat, hunger, sand, superstition, and backbreaking labor, it's time to ask the big question. Would you survive a single day in ancient Egypt? Let's be honest, probably not. Sure, it's easy to romanticize the ancient world. Golden tombs, lotus-scented air, graceful hieroglyphs, gods with animal heads, and a thing for order and beauty. But behind the iconic monuments and stunning art was a world of brutal realities that spared no one but the elite. Your average Egyptian day started with a dirt floor, a cloud of flies, and the knowledge that if you didn't work, you didn't eat. You walked barefoot on blazing sand, hauled water, cooked over open fires, lived shoulder to shoulder with bugs, smoke, and livestock. You worried about disease, divine punishment, and whether a snake might slither into your sleeping mat. You had no toothpaste, no medicine, no retirement plan, and if you were lucky, maybe 2 changes of linen. You served a god king who could take your land with a decree, a climate that cooked your skin by noon, and a religion that required you to pass a literal divine test after death just to get into the good version of the afterlife. Let's also not forget the things you didn't have. No antibiotics, no sunscreen, no privacy, no plumbing, no painkillers, and no easy escape. Once you were born into your class, that was it. No promotions, no career changes, no finding yourself. You were either a scribe, a farmer, a laborer, a mother, a servant, or dead. And yet, for all this, the ancient Egyptians weren't miserable. They believed deeply in their gods, their purpose, and the beauty of life. They loved music, dance, food, family, and festivals. They joked. They painted. They imagined eternity with enough clarity to build stone monuments that still stand today. But for a modern person, without your air conditioning, your filtered water, your Advil, your sneakers, and your smartphone, you'd fold before the second sandstorm hit. So no, you wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt. But that's okay, because they lasted thousands of years. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we still talk about them. In the heart of ancient Teotihuacan, one pyramid refuses to be forgotten. Its surface is adorned not with peaceful symbols of faith or gentle gods, but with snarling, open-mouthed stone serpents, dozens of them. They jut out from the temple's facade as if frozen in mid-strike, fangs bared, eyes wide. This is the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, known to many as the Temple of Quetzalcoatl. But unlike most temples that reach for the sky with reverence, this one feels different. It feels predatory from the moment you approach it. There's an eerie sense that you're being watched. The stone serpent heads aren't mere decoration. They were warnings, symbols of divine wrath, and beneath their gaze, something horrific once unfolded. Excavations over the past few decades have revealed something that archaeologists didn't expect. Hidden beneath the temple's base were not just ceremonial offerings, but something far more disturbing than human remains. And not a handful. Over 200 bodies, many of them decapitated, hands bound behind their backs. Young men, warriors, perhaps buried in groups, ritual sacrifices arranged with mathematical precision. Some were buried with obsidian knives at their sides, others with necklaces made of human teeth or jewelry crafted from jawbones. They weren't simply thrown into the ground. They were deliberately placed in positions of symbolic significance. It's clear this was no mass grave. It was a message, a divine transaction carved into stone and sealed with blood. But what kind of belief system justifies such horror? Who demanded so many lives be taken at once? The Temple of the Feathered Serpent wasn't just a religious building. It was a theater of power. A place where rulers fused cosmology, warfare, and fear to maintain control over a city of more than 100,000 souls. And this ritual bloodletting may have been the cost of keeping the cosmos in balance. As you stand before this temple today, gazing at those stone serpents, you're not just looking at art or architecture. You're looking into the eyes of a civilization that believed the gods needed blood and that they had every right to deliver it. But who were these people? Who commanded such violence and vanished without a trace? The answer lies in the shadows of Teotihuacan. Before the mighty Aztec Empire, before the Maya carved their cosmic calendar into stone, there stood a city unlike any other in the ancient Americas, Teotihuacan. Its name, given by the later Aztecs, means the place where gods were born. And when you walk its immense avenue of the dead, flanked by pyramids that scrape the heavens, you start to understand why. At its height, around 100 to 250 CE, Teotihuacan was a sprawling metropolis of over 100,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time, rivaling ancient Rome, Alexandria, and Chang'an in size and influence. It was a city of meticulously planned, wide boulevards, grid streets, apartment compounds housing extended families, multi-story structures made from volcanic stone, and at the center of it all, three massive pyramids. The Pyramid of the Moon, the Pyramid of the Sun, and the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. But here's what makes Teotihuacan different. No one knows who built it. Seriously, to this day, we don't know the name of the people who constructed this place. We don't even know what they called themselves. There are no written records, no king's names carved into stone. Teotihuacan seems to have been a society ruled not by a single monarch, but perhaps by a council, a theocracy, or something altogether foreign to our understanding of ancient power. And despite this anonymity, their influence was colossal. Evidence of Teotihuacan's power has been found hundreds of miles away from the Maya cities of Tikal and Copan, to the distant Zapotec capital of Monte Alban. Obsidian blades, ceramic styles, murals, and even political meddling. In one case, Teotihuacan emissaries may have helped overthrow a local Maya king to install a ruler more favorable to their interests. But how do they maintain such a vast network? How did a city with no known writing system command such authority across Mesoamerica? The answer may lie in how they combined cosmic ideology with statecraft. Their temples were more than places of worship. They were tools of control, aligning perfectly with astronomical events, serving as theaters of ritual sacrifice, and reminding every citizen and every visitor that Teotihuacan was no ordinary city. It was the axis of the world, a sacred engine that kept time, fate, and blood flowing in sync. And at the heart of it all stood the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. To understand the temple, you must first understand the deity it was dedicated to, the Feathered Serpent. Known later by the Aztecs as Quetzalcoatl, and to the Maya as Kukulkan, this figure is one of the most enigmatic gods in all of Mesoamerican mythology. But in Teotihuacan, centuries before the Aztecs rose to power, the Feathered Serpent was already central, possibly supreme divine force. But here's the paradox. What kind of god is both a serpent and a bird? Think about that. Serpents slither through the underworld. They shed their skin, symbolizing rebirth, duality, and death. Birds soar high in the sky, closer to the sun, representing freedom, divinity, and life-giving wind to combine these two earthbound and sky-dwelling. Death and life, chaos and order was to create something entirely cosmic, something terrifyingly powerful. The Feathered Serpent wasn't just a god. He was a bridge between worlds. On the facade of the temple, carved in deep relief, we see dozens of his images. Goggle eyes, bared teeth, plumed headdresses. Some historians believe these represent God himself. Others suggest they're warriors or priestly figures. Adorned in divine regalia to signal their authority, they are everywhere. The temple is covered in these snake-bird hybrids, as if the structure itself breathes with divine presence. But the Feathered Serpent wasn't just a god of the heavens. He was intimately tied to sacrifice. Blood was the fuel that kept the cosmos in motion, and Quetzalcoatl, though later remembered as a gentle civilizing deity, had a much darker role in Teotihuacan. He demanded offerings, and not just of maize or incense, but of life itself. In some myths, he descended into the underworld to retrieve the bones of the dead and create humankind. But to bring life from death, there had to be a trade. The The gods sacrificed themselves for humanity, and humans, in return, were expected to do the same. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent wasn't just a monument to faith. It was a cosmic engine designed to link the sky, the earth, and the underworld through ritual. Every stone, every serpent head, every buried victim fed into that system. Teotihuacan didn't just worship the feathered serpent. They embodied his logic, paradox, power, and blood, and the most disturbing truths were hidden beneath the surface. For centuries, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent stood silently, a weathered, imposing structure half swallowed by time. Locals whispered legends. Scholars made guesses, but no one could have imagined what was buried beneath its layered stones until archaeologists broke through in the late 1980s and early 2000s. What they found wasn't just unexpected, it was unsettling. Hidden beneath the temple's foundations were a series of long-sealed chambers and pits, each filled with carefully arranged human remains. These weren't the messy results of war or disease. These were deliberate sacrifices, systematic, ritualistic, cold. The victims, numbering over 200, were young men, many between 15 and 25. Some wore necklaces made of human jawbones. Others had their hands tied behind their backs. A few were decapitated. Obsidian knives, sharp and black as night, were scattered nearby, the unmistakable tools of ritual slaughter. And this is where it gets darker. The arrangement of the bodies followed geometric and symbolic patterns. They weren't buried randomly. They were placed in quadrants, cardinal directions, possibly to mirror the cosmos. Even the number of bodies mattered. It wasn't just about death. It was about meaningful death. Offerings surrounded the victims. Jaguar bones, serpents, exotic shells from the distant Gulf Coast, figurines, and obsidian blades that had never been used in battle. This wasn't punishment. It was a gift. These young men, most likely warriors, had been selected not to die in disgrace, but to die as part of something transcendent. To the Teotihuacanos, the very act of building a temple may have required human sacrifice. It was as if every stone had to be consecrated with blood. Every layer was raised only after an offering had been made. The deeper you dig, the more sacrifice you find. In one chamber, archaeologists discovered elaborate tunnels filled with mercury and mica, materials associated with the underworld. The floor glimmered like water. Was this a symbolic passage to the land of the dead? A mirror of the night sky? The more they excavated, the more it felt like the temple was not built on top of death, but constructed to encase it. The blood didn't stain the stone by accident. The stone was meant to hold the blood, and all of it was for the gods. Look closer at the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, and you'll notice something strange, something unnerving. It doesn't just sit on the landscape, it aligns with the universe. Teotihuacan wasn't built randomly. The entire city was laid out along precise cosmic axes. Its central avenue of the dead runs at a 15.5-degree angle off true north. Not a mistake, but a deliberate shift, possibly to align with the setting of the Pleiades star cluster or the sun on specific ritual dates. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent sits directly along this avenue, locking it into a grand celestial blueprint. But why? What were they trying to align with? Archaeologists and archaeoastronomers have debated this for decades. Some suggest the temple lines up with equinox sunrise. Others argue it connects to Venus, the planet most sacred to Mesoamerican civilizations, often associated with war, sacrifice, and rebirth. When Venus rose or set, wars were declared, offerings made, and temples activated with ritual fire. Even the temple's dimensions seem intentional. The repetition of the number 7, the number of visible planetary bodies, appears in its step platforms. There's symmetry, rhythm, and a stunning understanding of both earthly math and cosmic cycles, and beneath the surface, more clues. In 2003, archaeologists uncovered a tunnel beneath the temple. Not a crude passage, but a deliberately constructed subterranean world. The walls were once covered in powdered pyrite, a shimmering mineral that would have reflected light like starlight. Combined with mercury pools and mica-lined walls, the tunnel seemed designed to replicate the cosmos itself. To walk through, it would be like traveling through the Milky Way, a symbolic journey to the underworld, or perhaps to rebirth. Was this temple not just a place of sacrifice, but a cosmic machine, a portal that aligned earth, sky, and the spirit realm? Some scholars believe Teotihuacano saw time as circular, not linear. Every ritual, every building, every sacrifice wasn't a one-time event. It was part of an eternal cycle, death leading to renewal, sacrifice fueling rebirth. The temple's alignments may have helped predict celestial movements, coordinate harvests, and more importantly, time when to offer blood. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent wasn't just looking at the stars. It was trying to speak to them. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent wasn't just a spiritual beacon, it was a political weapon. Its very design was meant to overwhelm, to intimidate, to remind every viewer, local or foreign, who held the reins of power in Teotihuacan. Imagine standing in its shadow 1,800 years ago. You, a visitor from a smaller city-state, would arrive at the Avenue of the Dead, already awestruck by the sheer scale of Teotihuacan. But when you reached the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, you'd freeze. The serpent heads stare at you, their fangs bared. Jaguar symbols growl from the stone. The plaza ahead once held massive gatherings, not just for celebration, but for public ritual. You might even witness a sacrifice. The ruling elite of Teotihuacan understood something crucial. Fear is power, and nothing stirs fear like divine wrath. By orchestrating ritual executions in broad daylight, surrounded by cosmic symbols and death imagery, they sent a clear message. The gods are with us, and we are not afraid to feed them. But this wasn't chaos. This was theater. Priests in feather headdresses and obsidian masks would chant, dance, and spill blood, turning cosmic myth into political performance. It wasn't just about pleasing the gods. It was about reminding everyone watching that the city's rulers had direct access to the divine. They alone could open the heavens or summon rain, protect the people, or destroy their enemies. Even the architecture helped reinforce this propaganda. From the temple's upper tiers, leaders could look down upon the plaza. They controlled not just the narrative, but the very physical space in which it unfolded. The people looked up at the gods, at the rulers, at the sacrifices, and knew their place. And for outsiders, Teotihuacan didn't need to conquer with swords. It is conquered with symbols. Visiting dignitaries would carry home tales of awe and terror. They would speak of the feathered serpents, the endless avenues, the blood rituals that lit the sky red. In a world where gods ruled through fear, Teotihuacan positioned itself as their chosen mouthpiece, and the Temple of the Feathered Serpent was the loudest voice of all. At its peak, Teotihuacan was the heartbeat of Mesoamerica, a city of fire and stone, of gods and blood, a city that seemed destined to last forever. But around the year 550 CE, something changed. Something broke. And the silence that followed was as chilling as the temple's stone serpent heads. The fall of Teotihuacan was not loud and glorious. It was gradual, then sudden. Signs of strain began appearing decades earlier, signs that the cosmic engine was faltering. Evidence points to a long period of drought, crop failure, and social unrest. The very systems that had sustained this grand city, centralized power, religious dominance, cosmic order, began to crack under pressure. And then came the fire. Archaeologists have uncovered widespread burn layers across elite compounds, temples, and administrative buildings, including signs of violent destruction at the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. What's strange is that the lower-class residential areas were mostly untouched. This wasn't an external invasion. This was an uprising, a rebellion, possibly from within. The very people who once watched sacrifices in awe may have risen against their priest-kings. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent, once a symbol of divine authority, was ransacked. Sculptures were defaced, fires were set, ritual spaces were desecrated, and then silence. Teotihuacan wasn't completely abandoned overnight, but it lost its soul. Trade networks collapsed. Artistic production ceased. The great rituals stopped. The ruling elite disappeared. The temple no longer spoke. And yet the mystery only deepened. Because while the city faded, its memory endured. Centuries later, the Aztecs arrived in the Valley of Mexico and stumbled upon its ruins. They were awestruck. They believed gods had built this place. They named it Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born. They built their own myths around its pyramids, revering it as sacred ground, even as they had no idea who its original builders were. To them, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent was not a ruin. It was a relic of divine truth. But the irony remains. The most powerful city of its time, built on cosmic order and blood, vanished without a written word, without a final record, leaving behind only stones and questions. The gods, it seemed, had gone quiet. For over 1,000 years, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent lay, buried beneath layers of dust, volcanic ash, and silence. Locals avoided it, farmers tilled around it, and the world forgot it until the modern age of archaeology arrived and cracked open the secrets buried within its heart. In the early 20th century, Mexican archaeologists began excavating Teotihuacan. What they found was astonishing, a perfectly engineered city far older than the Aztecs. But it wasn't until the 1980s and 2000s that the temple itself began to yield its most intimate and most chilling revelations. One of the most dramatic discoveries came in 2011, when researchers uncovered a sealed tunnel beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. It had been deliberately closed off nearly 100 to 800 years earlier, as if to prevent anyone from entering ever again. After years of excavation, scientists unearthed a cosmic corridor, a symbolic underworld lined with pyrite to mimic a starlit sky, pools of liquid mercury, and thousands of ritual objects, jade statues, rubber balls, obsidian blades, and even carved wooden masks. It felt less like a tomb and more like a message. Why would the ancient builders go to such lengths? What were they trying to preserve or hide? Some experts believe the tunnel was used in initiation rituals. Others suggest it symbolized the creation of the world, a mythological womb where gods were born, where kings were made, where divine order was negotiated between humans and the cosmos, the Mercury. Once thought to be only toxic, it may have represented water or the fluid veil between worlds. And among all these glittering fragments was one persistent whisper. The feathered serpent still lingered, not just as a myth, but as a presence in murals and carvings, in the geometry of the temple itself. The serpent hadn't disappeared. It had coiled inward, deep into the bones of the city, waiting to be rediscovered. And with each excavation, each uncovered jawbone or golden ornament, we draw a little closer to its message. One carved not in language, but in stone, sacrifice, and shadow. Modern science has given us X-rays, drones, and ground-penetrating radar. But even with all our tools, one truth remains. The temple still keeps secrets. Today, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent stands as a haunting monument, not just to a civilization long gone, but to a way of thinking that merged power, cosmos, and death into one unbreakable system. Tourists snap photos. Children run past the stone serpent heads, but the ground beneath their feet is soaked in 1,000 untold stories and over 200 known human sacrifices. And still the temple endures. Its legacy is not just architectural. It's psychological, spiritual, cultural. The feathered serpent, this paradoxical god of sky and earth, continued to evolve. He would be adopted by the Toltecs, then reborn by the Aztecs as Quetzalcoatl, where his myth took on a gentler tone, the bringer of knowledge, the god who wept for humanity, the one who vowed to return. This reimagining of the serpent god shows how myths don't die. They transform. Even in modern Mexico, echoes of the feathered serpent persist in art, in murals, in literature, and in national identity. The temple's image has appeared on coins, stamps, and even government buildings. It has become a symbol of mystery, of pre-Columbian brilliance, and of the untamed spiritual world that once pulsed through Mesoamerica. But there's another legacy, one less visible, more uncomfortable. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent forces us to confront the price of belief. It asks hard questions. How far will humans go to feel connected to the divine? What happens when power and religion become indistinguishable? Can beauty coexist with terror? In many ways, the temple isn't just a historical site. It's a mirror, a reflection of us, our fascination with life after death, our hunger for meaning, our capacity to build monuments of staggering beauty and to stain them with blood. The temple teaches us that greatness comes with shadows, that civilizations can soar to impossible heights while burying their secrets beneath the stones. And maybe that's why we keep returning, not just to visit, but to understand. Because deep down we know the serpent is still watching, not to strike, but to remind. Reminders of what we once were and what we still might be. Before we spoke in words, we spoke in rhythm. Tens of thousands of years ago, long before the invention of writing, even before the birth of language itself, early humans began to create something that could only be described as sound with intention. Not speech, not melody, but rhythm. A hand slapping hollow bark. A stick tapping a stone, a foot stomping earth in time. Somewhere in that ancient repetition, something magical emerged. The first drum beat. It wasn't called music. It wasn't called anything. But it felt like something, like communication, like movement, like emotion taking form. Anthropologists have uncovered evidence of primitive percussion instruments dating back over 30,000 years. These were likely made from natural materials. Tree trunks, hollowed out gourds, stretched animal hides. Nothing fancy, nothing preserved. But these rudimentary drums were not toys or idle distractions. They served real purposes to warn, to summon, to connect. Imagine a tribe scattered across a dense forest, one beat from a distant drum, and others new danger is coming or a celebration has begun, or the gods are listening. The earliest drums weren't just tools. They were extensions of the human body, a heartbeat externalized, a pulse that could be felt across a valley. Drumming wasn't something you watched or listened to. It was something you participated in together, around fires, under stars, in caves where echoes made the air itself vibrate. These ancient rhythms became a language of emotion, joy, grief, warning, hope, all expressed not in syllables or symbols, but in patterned sound. Before the first flutes were carved, before string instruments were dreamed of, the drum was already alive, anchoring us in time, giving shape to ritual, and uniting individuals into tribes. In that way, the drum became humanity's first instrument, and perhaps its first form of collective identity. No matter where on earth people lived, they created something to strive for, something to beat, something to mark the moment. Because even when we had no words, we had rhythm. And that rhythm was everything. In the cradle of early human civilization, drums were not just instruments. They were sacred voices. Every tribe, every culture, every corner of the earth developed its own rhythm. But the purpose was nearly universal, to commune with the unseen. In Africa, where some of the world's earliest drums emerged, rhythm was deeply intertwined with life, death, and ancestry. The djembe, carved from a single tree and wrapped in goat skin, was believed to contain three spirits: that of the tree it was carved from, the animal whose skin gave it voice, and the craftsman who brought it to life. Played in circles, the djembe didn't just accompany rituals. It was a ritual. Then there were the talking drums, capable of mimicking human speech through pitch and tone. In West Africa, these drums carried messages across miles, relaying news, warnings, births, and deaths from one village to the next. Long before the telephone, humans were already drumming their messages through the landscape. Across the oceans, Native American tribes treated the drum as a living entity. It was the heartbeat of Mother Earth, played in ceremonies to honor ancestors, summon healing, or guide the souls of the dead. The large powwow drum, played by a circle of drummers, was both a musical and spiritual engine, a communal pulse that aligned humans with nature and spirit. In Australia, the Aboriginal people used clap sticks and percussive stomps in the sacred dream time, a mythic era of creation. In the Arctic, Inuit shamans struck frame drums to enter trance states, seeking visions or communicating with spirits during long, dark winters. These weren't performances. These were tracks of survival, healing, storytelling, and connection. To drum was to remember. To drum was to belong. And always, it was communal. Drums brought people together into sacred circles, synchronizing hearts and intentions. No sheet music, no stage, just bodies moving, hands striking, souls stirring, all unified by rhythm. It didn't matter where on earth you stood. If you heard a drum in the distance, you knew. Something sacred was happening. Something that words alone could never express. From sacred circles to bloody battlefields, the drum has always spoken. Sometimes with comfort, and sometimes with command. As human societies evolved into kingdoms and empires, drums transformed into tools of domination, instruments of order, and weapons of fear. The earliest armies didn't have radios or megaphones. They had drums. In ancient China, massive drums called bows were struck to coordinate troops across vast terrains. With a single resonant boom, commanders could signal a charge, retreat, or flanking maneuver. These drums weren't just loud, they were strategic. Each rhythm meant something specific, and trained soldiers knew how to listen. Even through the chaos of battle in Mesopotamia, temple drums were used to announce rulers and summon the public. But in times of conflict, they echoed through city walls, terrifying enemies with a deep, relentless thunder. It wasn't just percussion, it was psychological warfare. When the Romans marched, they brought with them the tympanum, a frame drum used in processions and by cults like that of Cybele. Though not a battlefield instrument in the way horns and standards were, it carried symbolic power, the sound of empire, discipline, and order. But no army wielded drums quite like the Ottomans. Their metabands, the world's first known military orchestras, unleashed an overwhelming storm of drums, cymbals, and horns before battles. The relentless pounding of curse, giant kettle drums, and double-headed bass drums struck terror into the hearts of enemy forces. Some European accounts describe soldiers freezing in panic before even seeing the Ottomans paralyzed by sound. Drums also enforced power off the battlefield. In royal courts across Asia, Africa, and Europe, drum ensembles announced arrivals, marked coronations, and underscored political rituals. To beat a drum was to declare power is present. Even enslaved people in the Americas used drums as tools of resistance. On plantations, rhythmic communication kept culture alive and helped orchestrate secret rebellions. The drum, even under oppression, refused to be silenced. So whether it signaled divine right, military discipline, or raw fear, the drum has always carried a message. This is who rules, this is who marches, and this is the rhythm of power as civilizations branch out across continents. So too did their rhythms, evolving in form, purpose, and philosophy. In the East, drums became tools of precision, spirituality, and ceremony. In the West, they leaned into military power and eventually orchestral grandeur. Two worlds, two paths, one heartbeat. In India, the drum became a sacred instrument of divine language, the tabla with its crisp tones and fluid grace. It was used in classical music and devotional performances, but it was more than accompaniment. It was a conversation. Each stroke had a name, a meaning, a syllabic identity. Indian drumming wasn't just percussive, it was spoken poetry, trained over decades. The tabla player was not just a musician, he was a linguist of rhythm. In Japan, the taiko drum emerged as a ceremonial giant. Played in Shinto rituals, theater, and war, taiko required not just technical skill, but physical discipline. The drummers moved with martial precision, their stances grounded like warriors. In festivals, the booming taiko echoed through mountain valleys, believed to drive away evil spirits and call the gods down to earth. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, the kendang drum led the hypnotic flows of gamelan orchestras, guiding dancers and musicians in sacred temple ceremonies. These rhythms were layered, interlocked, and celestial, a sonic reflection of cosmic harmony across the world. In Europe, drums had a different story. They were largely utilitarian during the medieval period, signaling soldiers, marking time, enforcing discipline. It wasn't until the Renaissance and Baroque eras that drums began to enter formal music. Even then, they were kept in the background, timpani thundering beneath royal fanfare, or echoing in grand cathedrals. In this divergence you see two philosophies. These saw rhythm as art and spirit, something tied to breath, chant, and meditation. The West saw it as structure and force, a tool to rally, march, and measure. But both understood the drum's core power to shape time, to dictate pace, to elevate ritual, to connect humans in ways that transcend language. East or West, sacred or strategic, the drum remained central, always listening, always speaking. From mountaintop temples to jungle clearings, from desert fires to candlelit cathedrals, drums have always had a place where the human meets the divine. Long before organized religion took root, Rhythm was already a sacred language, a way to pray, to summon, to transcend. In Africa, drums were not just instruments, they were spiritual beings. In Yoruba traditions, for example, the Batar drum was used to communicate with the Orishas, gods, and ancestral spirits. Drummers weren't performers, they were priests. The rhythms they played were encoded prayers, inviting the gods to descend and dance among the living. Each pattern had a purpose, each beat a direction in Hinduism. The drum appears even in the hands of gods. The deity Shiva, in his form as Natraja, dances the cosmic dance of creation and destruction with a small hourglass-shaped drum in hand, the Demru. Its beat represents the pulse of the universe itself. From silence to sound, from void to form, the drum is a divine heartbeat in Buddhism. The ritual frame drum is used in monastic chants and meditation ceremonies. Its slow, soft strikes guide breath and awareness, acting like a metronome for the soul. It's not loud. It's not aggressive. It simply reminds the practitioner to return again and again to the present moment. Across the Americas, indigenous tribes use drums in vision quests, sweat lodges, and healing ceremonies. The beat is constant, steady, mimicking the rhythm of the womb, helping participants enter trance states or connect with ancestral spirits. In these spaces, the drum doesn't just accompany prayer. It is the prayer. Even within Christianity, where rhythm was often subdued, the drum still found a sacred role. In gospel traditions, particularly in African American churches, drums became a means of praise and power. A heartbeat behind voices lifted in devotion, a reminder of struggle, hope, and divine rhythm in every life. No matter the faith, the ritual, or the God invoked, the drum has been there, not as decoration, but as a vessel for energy and tension and the mysteries we cannot speak. Because when words fail in worship, rhythm remains, and the divine always listens. For thousands of years, drums were solitary instruments, one body, one sound, one purpose. But in the heart of the industrial age, something revolutionary happened. In factories, streets, and music halls, percussion was reimagined. And by the early 20th century, multiple drums were no longer scattered across a stage. They were united, forming something entirely new, the drum kit. It was born out of necessity in the late 1800s. Military and theater bands required several percussionists to play bass drum, snare, cymbals, and woodblocks, each handled by a different person. But space was tight and budgets were tighter, so drummers began to combine instruments into a single, playable setup. By 1909, the first bass drum pedal was patented. A drummer could now strike a massive drum with one foot, freeing their hands to do more. The idea caught fire. Over the next few decades, drummers added hi-hats, toms, cowbells, and ride cymbals, creating a setup that could mimic an entire percussion section, all from one seat. What emerged was more than a tool. It was the drummer's throne. And then came jazz. In smoky clubs and underground dance halls of New Orleans and Chicago, the drum kit exploded into life. Jazz drummers didn't just keep time. They played the kit like a voice with syncopation, swing, and sensitivity. Legends like Gene Krupa and Buddy Rich turned the drum set into a lead instrument. Rhythm became storytelling. As jazz evolved into rock, the drum kit grew louder, heavier, and more powerful. The 1960s and 70s saw kits expand with multiple toms, splash cymbals, and double bass pedals. Drummers like John Bonham, Neil Peart, and Keith Moon pushed the limits of stamina and creativity. The drummer wasn't in the background anymore. He or she was the engine. Today, the drum kit is a global staple, from gospel churches to EDM stages, from punk garages to world tours. And even as digital kits and drum machines rise, the physicality of a live drum kit, the sticks, the skins, the sweat remains irreplaceable. It's a symbol of modern rhythm, a fusion of centuries where tradition meets innovation, and where one drummer can speak with 10 voices at once. The world beats in thousands of dialects, and so do its drums. From continent to continent, culture to culture, the drum has taken countless forms, each carrying a distinct identity, sound, and purpose. These aren't just instruments, they're cultural signatures, crafted from local materials, shaped by local hands, and steeped in the rhythms of everyday life. In West Africa, the djembe remains a heartbeat of community gatherings. It speaks in sharp slaps and deep bass tones, designed for storytelling and spontaneous conversation. Next to it, the dandun provides the foundational pulse, a rhythmic anchor around which others can dance. In Africa, a drum ensemble isn't just music. It's a conversation between spirits, ancestors, and the living. In the Middle East, the dabuka, a goblet-shaped drum made from clay or metal, delivers crisp, fast-paced rhythms essential to belly dancing and classical Arabic music. Its voice is sharp and articulate, demanding precision from its player and movement from its listeners. Across the Caribbean and Latin America, drums tell a different story, one born from resilience and fusion. The conga, bongo, and timberles reflect the blend of African, indigenous, and Spanish influences. In Cuba, the sacred bata drums are used in Santeria rituals, each drum speaking a divine language tied to the Orishas. In Brazil, the thunder of surdo and cuica DR. Samba parades through the streets, infusing joy into protest, prayer, and carnival. In India, the mridangam and tabla dominate South and North Indian classical music, respectively. These drums are so precise they are tuned to pitch, blurring the line between rhythm and melody. Each finger movement matters. Each stroke carries centuries of tradition. Then there's the frame drum, one of the oldest in human history, appearing in everything from Persian daf to Irish bodhran. From shamanic tools to folk ensembles played with fingertips, mallets, or brushes, it's proof that even simplicity can be sacred. What unites them all? Purpose. Whether guiding dance, healing, ritual, or revolution, each drum reflects the soul of its people. Their rhythms carry geography, history, and identity. The global drum family isn't just diverse, it's universal. Because no matter where you go, the earth still echoes with rhythm. As the 20th century drew to a close, the sound of drums began to change, not in rhythm, but in texture. The physical gave way to the programmable. The sweaty palms, the wooden sticks, the calloused fingertips all began to share space with circuits, pads, and software. The age of digital drums had arrived. It began in the 1970s with primitive drum machines, early devices like the Rhythm Icon and Roland's R78 that used analog circuits to simulate basic beats. At first, they sounded robotic, even awkward. But musicians saw something else: consistency, control, and endless possibility. Then came a revolution. In 1980, Roland released the R808, a drum machine so iconic its deep, booming kick and crisp snare would go on to define entire genres. Hip-hop, techno, electro, and trap were all born in part from its synthetic pulse. It was no longer about mimicking acoustic drums, it was about creating new sounds entirely. As digital audio progressed, so did the tools. Electronic drum kits like the Roland Fee drums allow drummers to play naturally, while triggering thousands of sampled or synthesized tones. Artists could now rehearse silently, record without microphones, and switch drum kits with the press of a button. And with computers came digital audio workstations, DAWs like Ableton, FL Studio, and Logic. Now, anyone with a laptop could build complex rhythms, layering kicks, snares, hi-hats, and sub-bass into vast sonic architectures. Finger drumming on MIDI pads became an art form of its own. Some feared this shift meant the death of traditional drumming, a replacement of human feel with cold precision. But that didn't happen. Instead, hybridity emerged. Acoustic drummers began integrating triggers and samples into their kits. Producers started layering human-played drums with machine beats. The organic and the synthetic found a groove together. Digital drums didn't erase the past, they reimagined it. And today we live in a world where a single person in a bedroom can build rhythms once requiring entire orchestras, where ancient grooves from Africa, Asia, and the Americas can be sampled, twisted, and given new life in neon-lit dance floors. The tools have changed, but the purpose remains the same: to move bodies, to shape time, to make silence speak. Across every era, every empire, and every evolution in technology, one thing has never changed. The drum remains our oldest and most enduring voice. From ancient fire circles to modern concert halls, from sacred rituals to digital dance floors, the drum has never been just about music. It's about connection to ourselves, to each other, to something bigger. It is the heartbeat we all share. Not metaphorically, literally. Because even before we're born, nestled in the womb, the first rhythm we ever hear is that of our mother's heart. Steady, safe, alive. And when life begins, we chase that rhythm forever. The drum has been our companion through joy and war, through worship and protest. It has marched beside kings and risen with rebels. It has echoed through temples and subway tunnels. It speaks in every language because it is a language, one that bypasses thought and speaks directly to the body, the bones, the blood. In moments of grief, we drum to mourn. In moments of ecstasy, we drum to celebrate. And in the quiet spaces in between, we drum to remember who we are. Today, percussion continues to evolve. You can find handpan ST, musicians weaving new age rhythms on city corners, indigenous communities preserving ancient drumming traditions against all odds, stadium drummers rallying crowds in unison, children banging pots and pans with instinctual joy. Even artificial intelligence is learning rhythm, but no algorithm can replicate the human soul behind a single imperfect beat. Because rhythm is not just counted, it's felt. And maybe that's why the drum has outlived empires and trends. Because deep down, we all crave the anchor of time, the shared pulse that tells us we are here, together now. No matter how advanced our instruments become or how virtual our experiences grow, there will always be something profoundly grounding about skin on skin, stick on hide, hand on wood, a beat, a breath, a beginning. The drum is not a relic of the past. It is a reminder that we were always meant to move in rhythm, to listen, to feel, to play. And as long as humanity endures, the drum will never be silent. Before Manhattan became a forest of glass and steel, it was an island of shadows, not cast by towers, but by church steeples and sloping rooftops. In the early 1800s, the skyline barely existed. The city clung to the southern tip of the island. A dense sprawl of brick townhouses, timber-framed shops, and dirt-packed roads. Buildings rarely climbed beyond 5 or 6 stories. Not because ambition was lacking, but because gravity had the final say. The taller the building, the more weight it carried, and with stone and brick, height came a steep price. The walls had to be thicker at the bottom to support the upper levels, leaving less room inside and requiring enormous foundations. To build high was to build heavy. Heavy didn't make financial sense. So the city grew horizontally, spreading northward along a grid that had been planned in 1811, one of the boldest urban blueprints of its time. But underneath that grid, beneath the layers of cobblestone and soil, Manhattan held a secret weapon. Bedrock deep, dense and unwavering, the granite spine that ran beneath the island would one day support some of the tallest structures in human history. But for now, it lay quiet, untouched, waiting. Life in early Manhattan was noisy but grounded. Commerce bustled in the harbor, ships lined piers, and horses clattered through narrow streets. The economy grew, immigration surged, and the island swelled with energy. But still, the city hugged the ground. The sky remained untouched. The only real vertical statements were churches, Trinity Church being the most prominent. Its spire, completed in 1846, rose over 280 feet, and for a time it was the tallest structure in New York. But even that was more symbol than skyline. What no one knew then was that the skyline's future wouldn't be shaped by stone or wood, but by iron, steel, and vision. And it wouldn't be limited by the ground. It would rise far above it. Manhattan wasn't yet a city of towers, but the stage was being set. The island was ready, the dream was forming, and soon the skyline would begin to stretch. For centuries, gravity was the greatest architect in Manhattan. It kept buildings short, cities flat, and human ambition tethered to the earth. But in the mid-19th century, 2 breakthroughs would break the skyline wide open. One lifted people, the other lifted buildings. The first came in 1852, when an inventor named Elisha Otis unveiled his revolutionary safety elevator in a dramatic demonstration at the New York Crystal Palace. Otis stood on a platform suspended high above a crowd. He ordered the rope to be cut. The crowd gasped, but the platform didn't fall. A hidden mechanism locked the lift in place. With that single breathtaking moment, Otis changed the rules of height. Until then, the top floors of buildings were the cheapest. No one wanted to climb stairs, but once elevators became safe and practical, those upper floors became premium space, offering light, air, and status. The vertical city suddenly made economic sense, but being able to move people upward wasn't enough. Buildings still relied on load-bearing walls, which grew thicker and more cumbersome the higher they went. That's where innovation number 2 arrived, the steel skeleton. In the 1880s and 1890s, Engineers began using steel frames to support the weight of buildings, allowing exterior walls to become thin curtains rather than heavy structural anchors. This method, known as steel frame construction, gave architects a new freedom to build as high as the frame could handle. Suddenly, height was no longer a risk. It was a strategy. The technology had arrived. The materials were here. And Manhattan, with its solid bedrock and booming economy, was the perfect canvas. The island's tight geography encouraged vertical thinking, and its status as a financial capital meant that everyone from banks to newspapers wanted their name visible in the clouds. The elevator made the sky accessible. The steel skeleton made the sky buildable. Together, they didn't just change architecture, they redefined what a city could be now. The race would begin, not outward, upward. By the late 19th century, New York City was no longer content to sprawl. It wanted to soar. The ground was full, the streets were packed, and the only place left to build was up. With steel frame construction and the elevator now established, Manhattan became a proving ground and a skyline, a battlefield for ambition. The first shots were fired in the 1890s and 1890. The New York World Building, home to Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper empire, rose 20 stories above Park Row. It was the tallest office building in the world. Briefly, not to be outdone, the Park Row building claimed the title next in 1899, standing at 391 feet. Each new tower was a declaration, not just of wealth, but of vision. To build higher was to announce we are the future soon. The skyline began to sprout with steel giants. The Singer Building, completed in 1908, stood at 612 feet, becoming the tallest building in the world and the first structure to surpass the height of the spire of Trinity Church, which had held the record for over 50 years. But even that wouldn't last. In 1913, the Woolworth Building took the crown, designed by architect Cass Gilbert. And funded in cash by retail magnate Frank W. Woolworth, it rose 792 feet over 55 stories in a soaring display of neo-Gothic beauty. Dubbed the Cathedral of Commerce, the Woolworth wasn't just tall. It was majestic, an architectural sermon about America's rise as a modern power. But this wasn't just architectural competition, it was branding warfare. Corporations and institutions vied for the tallest, most distinctive buildings, towers that would etch their names into the sky. Every new height was a headline, every silhouette a symbol. The skyscraper became the ultimate billboard, permanent, imposing, impossible to ignore. And beneath it all, the rhythm of progress beat relentlessly. Steam shovels dug foundations into granite. Riveters hammered steel day and night. Immigrants and ironworkers balanced on beams hundreds of feet in the air with no harnesses, only grit and resolve. The skyline was no longer theoretical. It was real, and it was rising. As the 1920s roared through Manhattan, the skyline began to dance, not just climb. This was the era of Art Deco, a time when architecture wasn't only about height, but style. The Jazz Age poured elegance into steel and stone, and New York's buildings became icons of movement, light, and energy. The most dazzling of them all was the Chrysler Building. Completed in 1930, it stood 1,046 feet tall, briefly becoming the tallest building in the world. Commissioned by car magnate Walter Chrysler, the tower wasn't just a monument to corporate success. It was a symphony of design. Its stainless steel spire, built in secret and hoisted into place overnight, shimmered in the sun like a crown. Ornamental eagles modeled after hood ornaments jutted from the corners like guardians of the future. With its curves, chevrons, and machine-age detailing, the Chrysler Building didn't just scrape the sky, it seduced it. But the race wasn't over. Just a few blocks away, another titan was rising. The Empire State Building, completed in 1931 during the depths of the Great Depression, it soared to 1,250 feet, stealing the title from Chrysler and holding it for nearly 40 years. Built in just 410 days, with thousands of workers laboring through wind, snow, and steel dust, the Empire State wasn't just a building, it was a message. New York endures. While much of the country struggled, Manhattan pushed upward, and its buildings mirrored the era's dual identity, elegant but aggressive, optimistic yet competitive. The Art Deco style captured the contradictions of the time, geometric but graceful, modern but steeped in myth. Towers weren't just functional, they were sculpted, glowing at night like beacons of possibility. And yet, beneath all that glitter, there was purpose. These skyscrapers were built by barons and moguls who wanted more than profit. They wanted legacy, a permanent place in the skyline and in history. By the end of the 1930s, Manhattan's silhouette had taken shape. The city was no longer just a capital of finance. It was a cathedral of ambition, a skyline that didn't whisper progress. It shouted. After World War II, Manhattan's skyline entered a new phase, one less ornamental, more corporate. The elegance of Art Deco gave way to glass, steel, and straight lines. America was now a global superpower, and New York was the front office of that empire. The skyline adapted accordingly, not with decorative spires, but with monuments of efficiency. In 1952, the United Nations headquarters rose on the East River, a bold boxy glass tower flanked by low marble wings. It marked a shift in tone, global, diplomatic, futuristic. It wasn't just a building, it was an architectural statement about international order in the atomic age, and it set the tone for what would follow. Next came a Lever House in 1952 and the Seagram Building in 1958, both defining examples of the international style. These towers, with their curtain walls of reflective glass and steel frames, were minimalist by design. Free of decoration, stripped of sentiment, they didn't look like cathedrals or castles. They looked like machines, precise, modern, and ruthlessly practical. The Seagram Building, designed by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, was especially influential. Its bronze-tinted glass, uniform grid, and open plaza introduced a new kind of urban presence, not to impress with flourishes, but to project order, discipline, and power. This was corporate architecture at its peak. Cold, beautiful, and authoritative. As businesses boomed, so did the skyline. Midtown became the hub for America's major corporations, banks, media companies, law firms. These new skyscrapers didn't compete for beauty. They competed for square footage, for location, and for presence on the horizon. Gone were the soaring spires and gargoyles. In their place stood mirrored monoliths, anonymous giants that reflected not just the clouds, but the ambitions of Wall Street. And yet, in their silence and simplicity, these towers spoke volumes. They told the story of a country obsessed with growth, precision, and modernity. They defined the corporate era, shaping the look and feel of cities across the globe. But even amid all this glass and steel, one thing remained true. The skyline was still a symbol. Only now it whispered power rather than shouted beauty. By the late 1960s, New York was already a vertical masterpiece, but it still had room to dream bigger. That dream took shape at the southern tip of Manhattan, where a pair of identical towers would soon alter the skyline forever. They were bold, controversial, and unlike anything the world had ever seen. They were the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Conceived as a hub for global commerce, the World Trade Center project was overseen by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Architect Minoru Yamasaki designed the buildings with a radical minimalist approach. Vertical lines, aluminum cladding, no setbacks. Each tower would rise over 160 feet, dwarfing every building before them. The ambition wasn't just architectural, it was ideological. A statement of global connectivity, a new temple for capitalism. Construction began in 1966. To make room, an entire neighborhood, Radio Row, was raised. The foundations required a revolutionary technique known as the slurry wall, allowing engineers to build deep into the soft riverbed while holding back the Hudson. It was one of the most challenging engineering feats of its time. When completed in 1973, the Twin Towers weren't universally loved. Some critics called them sterile or boxy. Others mourned the loss of the ornate towers of past. But to many, the towers were pure presence, bold, confident, and commanding. They didn't dance with the sky like the Chrysler. They didn't taper like the Empire State. They stood firm, twin pillars of certainty and scale. More than just buildings, the World Trade Center became an international symbol. Of business, of unity, of American might. People came from around the world to visit the observation decks, to dine at windows on the world, or simply to stare up in awe from the plaza below. For nearly 3 decades, the Twin Towers dominated lower Manhattan. They anchored the skyline, giving it symmetry and gravitas. And while other cities built taller structures, none carried the iconic weight of those two towers rising side by side. The skyline had changed once again, this time not with ornament or artistry, but with monumental ambition. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the Manhattan skyline changed forever, not by cranes or construction, but by violence and smoke. In less than 2 hours, the twin towers of the World Trade Center collapsed into dust, fire, and twisted steel. Thousands of lives were lost, and the two pillars that had once defined Lower Manhattan were gone. The attack wasn't just an assault on people or buildings. It was an assault on symbols, on what those towers stood for. Commerce, modernity, freedom, ambition. For decades, the Twin Towers had defined the southern end of the island. Their clean, monolithic forms had become visual shorthand for New York itself. No, that skyline was fractured. In the days and weeks that followed, Lower Manhattan became a wound, open, smoldering, raw. Where once there had been height and light, there was only absence, and that absence echoed. Photographs of the skyline looked hollow. The familiar silhouette was broken, and the space that had once pulsed with global energy became known as Ground Zero for the first time in a century. Manhattan wasn't building up. It was mourning. The city grieved, but it also endured. Steel workers, firefighters, police officers, and volunteers poured into the site, not to construct, but to recover. The rubble was cleared. Lives were honored. Silence replaced the clang of iron. In a city always rushing forward, this was a forced pause, a long breath held in collective pain, but even in sorrow. New York did what it had always done. It looked up. Discussions about rebuilding were complicated, emotional, and political. What should take the place of the towers? Should anything rise again? Could the skyline be restored without erasing the loss? For years, the hole in the ground remained a reminder of what was and what was taken. It became sacred space, and yet slowly plans emerged. Designs were drafted, cranes returned, steel returned, not to erase the tragedy, but to create something new beside it. But before anything was built, one truth stood clear. The skyline was no longer just a symbol of power or ambition. It had become a memorial, a silhouette shaped by both triumph and tragedy. And the story wasn't over in the aftermath of devastation. A city known for speed, ambition, and movement paused, not to surrender, but to reimagine. Rebuilding the Manhattan skyline after 9/11 wasn't just a matter of architecture, it was a matter of identity. What would rise in place of the Twin Towers? Could anything? The answers came slowly. In 2003, a design by architect Daniel Libeskind was selected for the new World Trade Center site. It wasn't just about height. It was about healing, memory, and renewal. The plan would blend commercial space with public memorials, parks, transportation, and light. It wasn't a return to what had been. It was a statement of what could be. At the heart of it all stood a new tower, One World Trade Center, originally called the Freedom Tower, rising from the northwest corner of Ground Zero. It would become the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere at 1,776 feet, a number chosen to echo the year of America's independence. But this wasn't just about patriotism. It was about defiance, about reaching up again, despite loss. Construction began in 2006, and in 2014, One World Trade Center opened its doors, clad in shimmering glass and standing like a crystal obelisk. It didn't try to imitate the past. It offered something new, reflection, both literal and symbolic. The building changes with the sky, glowing, darkening, disappearing, depending on the light. It is presence without arrogance. Beside it, the 9/11 Memorial opened in 2011, two deep voids where the original towers once stood, each with a continuous waterfall. And the names of the fallen etched into bronze. It's not just part of the skyline, it's part of the city's soul. The new skyline took years to take shape. Other towers rose, 3 WTC, 4 WTC, and 7 WTC, each one sleek, modern, and purposeful. Together they represent not just a city rebuilt, but a city transformed. New York didn't just replace what was lost. It evolved. It honored the past while building for the future. And in doing so, it reminded the world of something deeply American and deeply human. You can knock a city down, but you can't keep it from rising. Today, the Manhattan skyline is more than a collection of buildings. It is a living symbol of ambition, of resilience, of the American dream itself. No other silhouette in the world carries so much weight. It's etched into pop culture, history, and memory. You can draw it with 5 lines and people will recognize it instantly. It tells a story of bold engineers and fearless ironworkers, of architects who imagined spires that pierce clouds, and of immigrants who crossed oceans to help build them. It speaks of risk, reward, and reinvention, the constant churn of New York itself. It has never been finished, and it never will be. The skyline is alive, always changing. In recent years, it stretched even higher, but not in lower Manhattan. This time, the vertical race moved uptown. Along Billionaire's Row, super slender residential towers like 432 Park Avenue, Central Park Tower, and 111 West 57th Street now rise like needles above Midtown. These skyscrapers are feats of engineering, pencil-thin, wind-tested, and made for the ultra-wealthy. Critics call them sky-piercing expressions of inequality. Others see them as marvels of modern ambition. Meanwhile, in Hudson Yards, an entirely new neighborhood has appeared with gleaming glass towers, public art, and corporate headquarters rising where rail yards once sprawled. The skyline now stretches farther evolving with the city's changing needs and ambitions. But even as it grows, the skyline holds its past tightly. The Empire State Building still glows at night, the Chrysler still gleams at sunrise, and One World Trade Center stands solemn and proud. The skyline remembers what came before, even as it reaches for what's next. More than any monument or statue, it is the skyline that defines New York, not just in form, but in meaning. It is a place where humanity dared to build upward. Again and again, through booms, busts, wars, and wounds. A city of millions, reflected in steel and glass. It doesn't just mark where the city ends, it marks where dreams begin. Because in Manhattan, the sky has never been the limit. It's just the next floor.